Welcome back, mystery lovers. Today's case is going to keep you on the edge of your seat. The case of Valyriia Vivano. Valyriia Fern Vivano was born on May 29, 1996, in La Granja, a small commune near Santiago, Chile's capital. She was the youngest of 3 children in a modest family, with her parents Miguel and Jacqueline Vivano. She grew up with her older brother Michelangelo and sister Daniela. Her father worked for a transportation company, while her mother stayed at home to care for the children and create a warm family atmosphere. When Valyriia started school, her parents decided to separate, which was a huge shock for her. Even though they continued to communicate after the divorce and her father is still very interested in his children's lives, including providing financial support, Valyriia felt resentment towards him. They sometimes argued and went months without speaking, but they always managed to reconcile. Soon after the divorce, Miguel remarried, and Valyriia gained 2 half-siblings. She maintained warm family relationships with them, as well as with her siblings, Daniela and Michelangelo. Jacqueline, on the other hand, never remarried. She focused on raising her children and later took care of her grandchildren. From a young age, Valyriia showed a strong character, determination, and remarkable perseverance in everything she did. She excelled academically, participated in sports, and was always brave and fair, willing to help others, even when it put her at risk. She pursued a career in law enforcement because of her desire to help people in need and fight for justice. After finishing high school, Valyriia enrolled in a police academy in Santiago, where she graduated with honors in 2016, becoming an investigator. At just 20 years old, she joined the Chilean police force. The following year, she started working in the bureau that investigates serious crimes in the capital. From the very beginning, Valyriia demonstrated her commitment as a law enforcement officer and her passion for justice. She loved her job, carried out her responsibilities with care, and was always ready to respond to emergencies, even in the middle of the night. She would rush to crime scenes, pursue criminals, and sometimes had to provide emotional support to people who had lost loved ones. Her colleagues described Valyriia as kind, cheerful, and friendly, while also recognizing her as a true professional and a dependable partner. Valyriia served in the police force for nearly 5.5 years, during which she received numerous awards and recognition. She advanced in her career, gaining the respect of her colleagues and the admiration of her superiors. She also represented her department in Spain, spending about 2 weeks in Madrid on an official visit. She took great pride in being entrusted with such significant responsibilities. By 2020, she had been promoted to assistant inspector. In January 2020, Valyriia welcomed a new member to her precinct, 21 years old Lionel Alejandro Contreras Canales, who had just graduated from the police academy. Valyriia took on the role of his mentor as he started his first job. A few months later, they became partners and initially got along well. Lionel comes from a wealthy and powerful family, with an uncle who is a high-ranking official. Having grown up in comfort and always getting what he wanted, because of this, he became quite selfish and believed that everything should go his way. Valyriia noticed her new colleague, Lionel, who repeatedly tried to get her attention and asked her out several times. Each time, she firmly rejected him. Valyriia was serious about her job and believed that workplace romances were inappropriate. She viewed Lionel as immature, not because he was 3 years younger, but due to his childish behavior. Despite this, she hoped to help him grow up. In July 2020, Valyriia and Lionel attempted to catch robbers who had stolen money from a store's cash register. The criminals remained at the scene and opened fire, leading to a shootout in which Lionel fatally shot both of them. While this situation could have been avoided, Lionel's response was considered appropriate for apprehending the suspects. Nonetheless, this incident put a strain on the relationship between Valyriia and Lionel. Valyria's last birthday celebration was on May 29, 2021, when she turned 25. The event took place at her mother's house and was attended by many guests, including family, friends, and co-workers. However, Lionel was not invited. Valyriia decided not to invite his, as he had recently tried to pursue her again, and she wanted to avoid any awkwardness. When Valyriia attempted to discuss with him, he only reiterated his feelings for her, which she preferred to keep private from her colleagues. Despite the big turnout, presents, warm wishes, and heartfelt congratulations, Valyriia appeared upset, even as she tried to smile. She had recently argued with her father and they hadn't spoken in days. Valyriia had hoped her father would come to her birthday, but instead, he only sent a brief congratulatory message and didn't even call. Jacqueline, her mother, recognized her daughter's unhappiness and understood the cause of her sorrow. Frustrated with her ex-husband's behavior, she believed he would eventually reach out to Valyriia and they would resolve their differences, as they had in the past. Tragically, Valyriia and her father never had the opportunity to speak again. Just 2 weeks later, on June 13, 2021, Valyriia lost her life while on duty. She was working the night shift, patrolling the streets and checking vehicles as part of a manhunt for a suspect in connection with a crime against a young woman that occurred yesterday on the outskirts of the capital. Authorities were on high alert for a white Kia, suspected to be driven by one of the criminals. The suspect likely had a weapon and may not have been alone in the vehicle. Valyriia was in a patrol car with her partner, Lionel, and they were being driven by Deputy Commissioner Felipe Gilardo. They spotted the suspect's vehicle and decided to chase it without waiting for backup. The officers successfully blocked the suspect's escape. Lionel and Vivano got out of their car with their guns drawn, ordering the suspects to surrender and exit their vehicle with their hands raised. Suddenly, a single gunshot was heard, leaving everyone confused about who had fired and from where. Valyriia, holding her side, collapsed onto the asphalt next to the police car. Reinforcements arrived at that moment, and Valyria's colleagues heard the gunshot and saw she was injured, but they didn't fully understand what had happened or who had shot her. Taking advantage of the chaos, the criminals quickly fled the scene while first aid was being given to the wounded officer. Despite the swift arrival of medics and the efforts of her colleagues to control the bleeding, Valyriia could not be saved. She was rushed to the nearest hospital, where top specialists worked hard to save her life for several hours. Unfortunately, due to severe blood loss and damage to vital parts, she passed away on the operating table without regaining consciousness. When Valyria's family received the news, her parents, brothers, and sisters quickly went to the hospital. Unfortunately, by the time they arrived, had already passed away. Miguel was not only heartbroken but completely shattered, as he never had the chance to talk to and make amends with his dear daughter after their last small argument. He felt an overwhelming sense of guilt and was so distressed by the tragedy that he needed medical help to avoid a heart attack. Valyriia was officially reported to have died while on duty during an operation aimed at capturing dangerous criminals. She was celebrated as a hero who sacrificed her life for the safety and well-being of others. Local media extensively covered the incident, with reporters highlighting her bravery and selflessness. The investigation into her death was conducted by experts from the Homicide and Major Crimes Division, where Valyriia had previously served. They determined that she died from a gunshot wound to the abdomen, inflicted by an assailant in the direction of the suspect's vehicle that she and her colleagues were chasing. The situation initially seemed straightforward, as witnesses supported the narrative, making it appear that the case had been resolved. The only task left was to locate and hold the offenders accountable, who were still at large and possibly fleeing. Shortly after, the suspects were caught, attracting significant public attention. The criminals were identified as 19-year-old Miguel Alejandro Capon and his 17-year-old accomplice, whose name was kept confidential due to his age. Both individuals had prior convictions for lesser crimes. The then president of Chile, Miguel Juan Sebastián Pinera, issued an official statement assuring the public that the perpetrators would face justice according to the law. However, nothing felt off. After the autopsy and necessary examinations, Valyria's body was returned to her family, who gave her a respectful burial in one of the city's cemeteries. Hundreds attended the funeral to pay their respects and offer condolences to her family. Jacqueline and Miguel described the entire experience as a nightmare. Among those who carried Valyria's coffin was her colleague Lionel, who seemed to grieve more than anyone else. However, other colleagues noted there had recently been some tension between them, to the point that Valyriia hadn't invited Lionel to her birthday party. Shortly after the funeral, court proceedings began for the suspects who had been arrested the day after the incident and were currently in custody. Everyone believes that the person responsible for Valyria's death has been caught, and proving their guilt seems simple, especially when they begin to give confessions. However, it soon became apparent that the investigation had serious flaws from the beginning. Important details were missed, and crucial forensic evidence was minimized. The process was mismanaged, and higher officials tried to hide the identity of the actual person responsible for Valyria's death. About a month and a half after Valyria's death, the case took an unexpected turn. By the end of July, 2 employees were suspended for their alleged involvement in the incident that led to Valyria's death. On August 1st, the parents of Valyriia were summoned to the prosecutor's office in the capital for an important meeting. They believed this meant that new evidence had come to light, and that the detainees would finally face the punishment they deserved. Miguel and Jacqueline were devastated to hear that Valyriia was killed by a bullet fired by a colleague. Prosecutor Juan Carlos Carrasco personally announced the news, expressing condolences and apologizing on behalf of the entire investigation team. Valyria's parents were in shock. They couldn't grasp how it could have occurred. The fatal shot that killed Valyriia was fired from a gun by one of her colleagues. A ballistics examination conducted that day confirmed this, but the results were inaccurately reported. The bullet taken from the body Valyriia was incorrectly categorized with different characteristics, such as shape, caliber, and weight. Additionally, the bullet had passed through the body rather than being extracted from it. There was a mix-up in the forensic reports regarding the entry and exit wounds. The bullet did not enter through the abdomen and exit through the back as stated. In fact, the shot was fired at her back. Several pages from the autopsy report were missing, and others had been obviously tampered with. Furthermore, the detainees involved in the trial, who supposedly admitted their guilt and were about to be sentenced, began to file complaints. They alleged that their confessions were obtained through torture and intimidation, and that the firearm they had that night was not loaded. Valyria's story takes a sudden turn when she goes from a tragic hero who died on the job to a victim of betrayal, murdered by her own colleagues. In light of these new developments, the main suspects became Felipe Gilardo Era, the officer driving the police car, and Valyria's partner, Lionel Alejandro Contas Canales, who was in the back seat. Both were promptly suspended from their duties. On August 5th, it was revealed that the bullet that killed Valyriia came from a service weapon. Later, an examination report showed that only Lionel had gunshot residue on his hands, making him the prime suspect. Interestingly, this information had not been disclosed earlier, as if it had been overlooked entirely. Several reports related to the ballistics examination and the pathologist's findings were mistakenly placed in an archive box, which was not properly reviewed. It remains unclear whether this was due to an accident, criminal negligence, or an intentional effort to hide important information. Now, the police officers involved in to capture the criminals that night are themselves regarded as suspects in the murder of Valyriia. They, along with the previously arrested suspects, participated in a reenactment of the incident from that night. Felipe stated that from the driver's seat, he could only see Valyriia, who was next to him in the front passenger seat and was the first to get out of the car. Lionel was sitting in the back and also exited, but the driver couldn't see his actions. Valyriia had taken only a few steps when a shot rang out, she fell, and the suspect's car they were pursuing sped away. Lionel quickly ran to help Valyriia. Lionel mentioned that he and Philippe exited the patrol car almost at the same time, but she had rushed forward as soon as the shot was fired. He firmly maintained that he did not shoot Valyriia, and Philippe must witness and confirm this. He also confirmed that he was the first to reach Valyriia and attempted to apply pressure to her wound. The testimonies from the witnesses varied, but the investigation revealed that Lionel was positioned behind Valyriia at the time of the gunshot, and the bullet's path confirmed his location. Additionally, he was the only one with gunshot residue on his hands. New information from previously undisclosed reports and exam results led to potential motives for the crime. Lionel was arrested as the main suspect, while the previously detained young men were released with a non-exit agreement, since there were no charges against them. However, the reason for Lionel's actions is still uncertain. The primary theory was that the incident was a tragic accident. It is believed that Lionel, inexperienced officer, accidentally discharged his weapon while standing behind Valyriia. In a state of panic, he tried to assist her, and when he returned his service weapon that day, he claimed he hadn't fired it. However, the truth soon emerged, and the young man's powerful relatives used their wealth and connections to try to cover up the incident. Because of that, the cleaned reports, missing documents, confusing evidence, and coerced testimonies from the detained individuals contributed. One theory, which Lionel himself partially confirmed, was that he was in love with Valyriia and desperately wanted her attention. Unfortunately, his attempts only annoyed her, and she didn't even invite him to her birthday party, which the whole department attended. The shot in the back was his way of seeking revenge for this rejection. Another theory, suggested by Valyria's relatives, was that Valyriia had uncovered something she shouldn't have, perhaps a corruption scheme or official misconduct. Being an honest and fair person, she would expose the culprit, leading to her being murdered to cover up the evidence. Young Lionel was chosen to carry out this act, with the promise that he would remain above suspicion. After Philippe was taken into custody, suspicions regarding Philippe remained. He was armed with the same type of service weapon, stood behind Valyriia, and had the opportunity to fire the shot. Additionally, Philippe had a history of discipline for the unjustified use of a weapon during a criminal arrest, although no one was hurt in that incident. Because of this, he earned the nickname, the Reckless Shooter. Lionel's defense team quickly adopted this theory, claiming that Philippe accidentally shot Valyriia. Since both Philippe and Lionel carried identical service weapons, it was possible that the guns were mixed up or intentionally swapped. Additionally, Philippe was inconsistent in his testimony, changing it multiple times. He later said he couldn't accurately recall the incident of that night because everything happened so quickly. However, no gunpowder residue was found on his hands, suggesting he was innocent. In response, Lionel claimed that gunpowder got on his hands while he was applying pressure to Valyria's wound, and that Era, who also assisted she, might have washed his hands before the examination. This explanation was not credible, as Valyria's blood stains were still on Philippe's hands, and it is impossible to wash away gunpowder without also removing blood. The trial and verdict have raised concerns about the competence of the investigation team, leaving Valyria's parents feeling desperate in their quest for justice. The new developments in the case led to public outrage and diminished trust in law enforcement. This story garnered attention not just from Chilean media but also from international outlets. As a result, several high-ranking officials were suspended or lost their jobs, including the head of the Homicide Investigation Department. Following a further investigation, Lionel was identified as the sole suspect, with all others cleared and designated as witnesses. In the spring of 2022, he was officially charged and remained in custody until the trial concluded. The hearings for the case began in March of the following year, and based on the evidence and witness testimonies, Lionel's guilt was clearly established. At first, the prosecution charged Lionel with intentionally murdering Valyriia and aimed for the harshest possible sentence. But Lionel maintained that he would never hurt Valyriia because he loved her. However, the bullet that killed her came from his gun. Lionel Alejandro Contas Canales was convicted of manslaughter and received a 12-year prison sentence, with the possibility of parole after 8 years. After the verdict was announced, the Vivano family voiced their disappointment, believing the sentence was too light. Meanwhile, Lionel and his legal team quickly filed several appeals. In February 2024, Valyria's family received a shocking update when the Supreme Court unexpectedly reduced the punishment for Lionel to just 540 days in prison, starting from the day he was arrested. This meant he effectively walked out of the courtroom a free man. In response, Valyriia Vivano's family intends to sue the Chilean government, alleging that the judges acted corruptly. In a statement, Valyria's mother expressed her heartbreak, stating that the original 12-year sentence had felt too lenient, but the new decision felt like a mockery. She mentioned that it was as if she had lost her daughter all over again and that she no longer had faith in justice. Furthermore, she emphasized that their family was determined to hold the negligent Chilean government for what had happened. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Lisa Valdez. Lisa Valdez was born on September 6, 1961, in San Francisco, California. She has an older brother and a loving mother. Although her father was absent from their lives, but Lisa and her mother shared an exceptionally close bond, rarely arguing. Those who knew them admired the harmony in their relationship. During her teenage years, Lisa developed a passion for dancing. She also became interested in IT, which was a relatively new field at the time. Notably, she was an early user of email, using it before many of her friends knew of its existence. This interest significantly influenced her future career path. Following college, Lisa got a job as a software analyst in San Francisco. Her mother later used her savings to purchase a small studio apartment for Lisa in a prestigious neighborhood, which offered a stunning city view. Living alone, Lisa advanced in her career, prioritized family time, and continued dancing, attending weekly practice sessions with her best friend. On May 16, 1998, Lisa, who was 36 at the time, hosted an evening gathering with her mother and some family friends. After the guests departed, her mother helped with the dishes and then headed home. Before leaving, Lisa promised to call her mother the next day, but the call never came. Initially, Lisa's mother thought she was simply busy, especially since she had dance practice scheduled for that day. However, as the day progressed without any communication from Lisa, her mother began to worry. The following day, Lisa's mother tried calling her, but there was no answer. She continued attempting to reach Lisa, but her calls went unanswered. On Monday, the fourth day since they last spoke, Lisa's colleagues contacted her mother to express their concern that Lisa had not shown up for work and was not responding to their calls. This was highly unusual, as Lisa was known for her reliability and always notified her workplace if she needed to take a day off. Lisa's mother grew increasingly concerned, so she decided to visit an apartment complex to check on her. When she arrived, she witnessed a disturbing scene. The building was surrounded by police tape and there were a lot of police officers. She asked the police what was going on, and they told her that earlier that day, some residents had reported a strange smell coming from one of the apartments. The building manager checked and found an unlocked door, then went inside and found a body on the floor, and they called the police. The police then were promptly called to the scene. Police officers quickly identified the victim as Lisa. Her body showed clear signs of trauma and decomposition, indicating she had been murdered several days prior. The presence of blood stains on the floor and bed, along with her partially undressed state and underwear found next to her body, suggested she had been being attacked and sexually abused. The room was in disarray, but further investigation revealed that this was typical of Lisa's living habits. The TV was on, and the air conditioner was set to 78 degrees. No signs of robbery were present, with valuables and jewelry left untouched. However, Lisa's keys and a gym bag were missing. A peculiar detail was the removal of some of Lisa's hair by the attacker, hinting at strong personal motives. The numerous injuries on her body further supported this theory. The detectives suspected that the killer might have had a prior relationship with Lisa and cherish a deep-seated hatred for her, given the lack of forced entry and the secure nature of the fenced apartment complex. Additionally, the apartment complex was secured with a fence, and access required either a key or to be let in by a resident. The police began interviewing residents in the apartment building, searching for someone who might have seen the attacker. They quickly found a lead when one of Lisa's neighbors reported that 2 days earlier, upon returning from vacation, he noticed damage to the metal frame of his front door and a faint blood stain. Although he had informed the manager, but they decided not to report it to the police, as it appeared his apartment had not been broken into. Detectives believed the same person who killed Lisa was responsible for the damage to the neighbor's door. However, the motives behind these actions were unclear. One theory was that the killer tried to break into the neighbor's apartment, was caught by Lisa, and subsequently murdered her. Another theory suggested the attempted break-in might have occurred after Lisa's murder, which seemed unusual. Detectives speak with the housekeeper who cleaned Lisa's apartment weekly. 2 days before Lisa's body was found, the housekeeper attempted to enter the apartment, but found the door blocked from the inside. Through a crack in the door, she saw a partially undressed woman on the floor and heard a man's voice. Believing she was interrupting a private moment, she left immediately. Police suspected that Lisa was already dead at this time and the man's voice belonged to her killer, who was still inside the apartment. The housekeeper mentioned a suspicious detail, a black bag with a zipper near the body. However, she was uncertain since she only caught a glimpse. On the inside of Lisa's apartment door, an envelope with cash was taped, untouched. This money was intended for the housekeeper, a frequent habit of Lisa. The fact that the envelope was still there suggests that Lisa was likely attacked after her mother departed, sometime between midnight and the early hours of the morning, which would have been when Lisa normally left the payment. Neighbors from the floor below corroborated these things. They reported hearing thuds and someone descending the stairs, although they didn't see the individual. As detectives searched Lisa's apartment, they discovered an unusual detail: the toilet seat was up, uncommon for a woman living alone. Forensic experts found a partial fingerprint that didn't match Lisa's. The police collected fingerprints from Lisa's acquaintances and relatives who may have visited her apartment, but none matched. This led detectives to believe that the fingerprint might belong to the killer. The medical experts completed their report, revealing new information about Lisa's case. Her body had over 20 stab wounds, but due to decomposition, it was unclear if she had been sexually assaulted. However, defensive wounds on her body suggested that Lisa had attempted to fight off her attacker. Furthermore, skin particles were found under her nails, which were likely from the killer, and were sent to the lab for analysis. In the meantime, forensic experts analyzed evidence from the apartment and discovered a crucial clue: a pillowcase with multiple blood stains. Upon closer examination, it was determined that not all of the blood on the pillowcase belonged to Lisa, as some of the stains were from a different source. As a result, the pillowcase was sent to the lab for further testing. Investigators suggested that the killer may have unintentionally hurt himself while stabbing Lisa, which can happen when using a knife. Supporting this hypothesis was the discovery of 2 bandages from a first aid kit inside the toilet. The killer might have used these to stop his bleeding and potentially left fingerprints on the toilet seat when disposing of the bandages. DNA analysis revealed that the blood on the pillowcase came from an unknown male not listed in the FBI database. This man's DNA also matched skin particles under Lisa's nails and a blood stain on her pillowcase. Despite no matches in the DNA database, detectives obtained the killer's DNA profile. They then compared it to DNA samples from suspects in their system who had committed crimes in Lisa's area and closely examined her acquaintances. Lisa's mother shared information about Lisa's relationship with a man named Albert Ketto, stating they had plans for a date the day following the murder. However, these plans were canceled by Albert a few days beforehand. When detectives questioned Ketto, they noticed a large cut on his hand, which made them suspect him as the killer. And he might have injured themselves while stabbing Lisa. Despite this, Albert denied any involvement in the murder. The detectives took his fingerprints and DNA samples for comparison, but surprisingly, they did not match the blood on the pillowcase or the skin particles found under Lisa's nails. Investigators continued their search for other suspects by reviewing the messages on Lisa's answering machine from the days leading up to the murder. After making a list of 40 people texting Lisa, they found one message particularly suspicious. Just hours before the murder, while Lisa still had guests at her home, a man called her, but she didn't pick up, he leaving a strange message. "You know how it goes, Tita. Hey Lisa, are you home?" When police played this message for one of Lisa's friends, the friend immediately identified the voice as Albert Robinson, a work colleague of Lisa's. Albert had made his feelings for Lisa known, but she had rejected his advances. Despite this, they remained friendly at work and, with Lisa considering him a friend. During the memorial service for Lisa, something else happened. Albert attended the service and delivered a speech that left everyone perplexed. He asserted that he and Lisa were intensely in love and had plans to get married and start a family. However, Lisa's friends and mother disputed Albert's things, stating that they were entirely false. According to them, Lisa had mentioned that Albert had expressed interest in her, but she did not reciprocate his feelings. Lisa's mother also emphasized that Lisa would have confided in her about such significant plans. Albert was questioned by the police and he denied being involved in Lisa's murder. He claimed to love her and said he would never hurt her. However, he refused to give the police his DNA sample and fingerprints, which raised suspicions. As a result, detectives continued to investigate him and look for new evidence. It is possible that Lisa's failure to reciprocate Albert's feelings made him hate her and kill her in revenge. The violent nature of the murder suggested that it was personal, and the fact that the killer cut off some of Lisa's hair and took it with him could be related to Albert's fixation on her. Detectives got a search warrant for Albert's house and found it filled with dozens of Lisa's photos, further evidence of his obsession. Despite this, he continued to deny any involvement in the murder. He voluntarily provided his fingerprints and DNA, which were sent to the lab for analysis. However, the lab results showed no match with the DNA and fingerprints found at the crime scene. As a result, he was cleared as a suspect, and the investigation continued. Years went by with no new leads, and the case remained unsolved. Investigators regularly checked DNA and fingerprint databases, hoping the killer would be caught for another crime, but there were no matches. Police were initially baffled that the perpetrator of such a heinous crime did not appear in any databases, so they doubted it was his first serious offense. Despite ongoing searches over the years, the police couldn't find any matches. Lisa's mother made multiple television appearances, pleading for anyone with information to come forward, yet detectives remained without new leads. In 2010, detectives discovered the FBI had begun utilizing a new DNA technology to identify suspects by comparing their DNA samples with those in the database to find relatives. This method, unlike genetic genealogy which emerged later, was only effective for locating close relatives, such as a father or brother. With no other leads, police requested a comparison in 2011 and waited. On September 2nd, lead detective Ive received a call from the FBI. They said that when the experts retested the DNA sample, they got a perfect match. The DNA from blood and skin particles under her nails matched a 52-year-old man named Anthony Hughes, who had recently been added to the FBI database. Anthony had a lengthy criminal record that went back decades, but previously, his crimes didn't qualify for his DNA to be included in the FBI database. However, due to updates in legislation, it became mandatory for individuals convicted of crimes in California to provide DNA samples, irrespective of how minor the offense was. Anthony's DNA sample was added to the database following his arrest for a minor shoplifting offense. In addition to his DNA, his fingerprints were also entered into the database, and they were found to match a fingerprint discovered on Lisa's toilet seat. Specialists were even able to pinpoint which specific finger left the print with relative ease. Before arresting Anthony, detectives searched for more evidence linking him to the crime. They stumbled upon a new clue. 13 years prior, police had reviewed messages left on Lisa's answering machine, but only those received before her murder. Now, after all these years, detectives found that Anthony had left a message for Lisa just a day after her death. The message itself was unremarkable and didn't raise suspicions. However, if the police had investigated Anthony at that time, they won't just find out his dense criminal history but also another important piece of information. Upon reviewing Lisa's belongings, detectives discovered Anthony's phone number in her address book, which confirmed that Lisa and Anthony knew each other. Further investigation, including conversations with Lisa's friends, revealed that Lisa and Anthony had dated briefly in high school. With this new information, detectives felt they had sufficient grounds to question Anthony. However, since he didn't have a fixed address at the time, they decided to approach him cautiously to prevent him from fleeing. When they arrested him, they initially told him that he was being investigated in connection with a series of robberies in San Francisco. Anthony surrendered without resistance. During the interrogation, detectives initially asked Anthony about the robberies. They then inquired about his relationship with Lisa. Initially, Anthony denied knowing Lisa, but when shown her photo, he acknowledged that they had known each other in high school. He also claimed that he hadn't seen her since the late 1980s. Detectives spent several hours questioning Anthony about his relationship with Lisa and whether he had seen her recently. When investigators confronted Anthony about the DNA evidence found in Lisa's apartment from 1998, his response was unexpected. He burst into tears and requested a pen and paper, seemingly prepared to confess. However, instead of writing a confession, he began hitting himself with the pen. Authorities had to restrain him as he continued crying and shouting, claiming he was being framed for a crime he didn't commit. Following this, Anthony was charged with Lisa's murder, and her family was informed that her killer had finally been caught. The trial was delayed by 4 years. Then, when it began, Anthony appeared confident, even smirking. However, later he began displaying religious symbols, such as carrying a Bible and wearing a cross. Detectives believed this was a tactic to sway the jury. Anthony's lawyer argued that he was physically incapable of committing the crime. A medical condition, diagnosed 5 years prior, had weakened his muscles, making it extremely difficult to perform repetitive movements. The lawyer argued that given this condition, Anthony could not have inflicted the more than 20 stab wounds found on Lisa. According to the medical report that year, Anthony's health condition was recovered well at the time of the murder. The prosecution had strong evidence that placed Anthony at the scene case, including his skin under Lisa's fingernails, his blood on a pillowcase, and his fingerprint on the toilet seat. However, regardless of the evidence against him, Anthony consistently denied having seen Lisa since the late 80s. The prosecution presented a theory that Anthony had gone to Lisa's home, attempted to initiate intimate contact with she, and when she rejected, he brutally murdered her. After the crime, he cut off a piece of her hair and took it with him as he fled. Anthony Hughes was ultimately given a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 16 years. In 2031, when he will be 72 years old. Anthony is currently serving his sentence in prison. However, he still maintains his innocence and says he was wrongfully convicted. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of McDermott family. Mark McDermott was born in the early 1960s in Australia. But we know that Mark was the eldest of 5 siblings. Known family members include his father, Bruce McDermott, and 2 sisters, Tracy and Nicole, with Nicole being the youngest. According to those close to him, Mark was not only a successful businessman but also a kind and easygoing person. Nicole described her brother as a wonderful person who avoided causing harm to others. Information about Mark's life is limited, especially regarding his adult life. However, we do know for sure that he traveled to the southern United States, although the reasons and circumstances are unclear. It was there that he met Johanna Dunn, a single mother raising a 4-year-old son, Donald Dunn. Donald Wayne Dunn was born in the early 1990s in West Virginia and lived there with his mother's family all his life. His grandparents played a major role in Donald's early upbringing, as they cared for him most of the time. Donald's mother, Johanna, was a single working mother who found raising a child difficult, so she asked her grandparents to help. On the rare occasions when Johanna and Donald were home together, she would often entertain him with video games or television. This reflected Johanna's difficulty in giving her son her full attention, although they tried to make time for each other. Their lives changed when Mark came along. Johanna and Mark quickly fell in love and married. Johanna took her husband's last name, and the 3 of them moved to West Virginia, becoming a happy family. From the beginning, Mark and Donald were very close, as if they were related by blood. Their relatives, including Mark's sister and father, confirmed that Mark treated Donald like his own son, and Donald also considered Mark his only father. The relationship between Donald and Mark was very close, which was evident when Donald was young. During the difficult times when Mark and Johanna were temporarily separated, Donald was still determined to stay with Mark instead of his mother. At the same time, the family faced a great challenge when Johanna was diagnosed with cancer. However, thanks to their support and solidarity, they overcame these difficulties together. Mark always took good care of his stepson, ensuring that Donald had a comfortable and fulfilling life. Although Donald is a simple man and does not ask for much, he is very grateful for the peaceful and luxurious life his stepfather has created for him. When Donald graduated from high school in 2008, Mark covered the entire cost of his college education. Donald attended Rio Salado College for the first 2 years, then transferred to Marshall University in 2010. Throughout this time, Mark continued to financially support Donald's education. Donald lives with his girlfriend and her family. He and his girlfriend have been in love since they were 15 years old. Despite this, Mark and Johanna have always been very supportive of Donald. They not only pay for Donald's tuition but also support him financially in many other ways. Specifically, they cover the costs of Donald's clothes, car insurance, daily living expenses, and food. Donald dedicates all his time and effort to studying. As a responsible and diligent student, he always strictly follows his daily study schedule. He often refuses or cancels plans to meet friends and relatives, citing the need to complete assignments or study for exams. Donald prioritizes studying above everything else in his life. During his 5 years in college, he always tried his best to graduate on time and not fall behind in any semester. May 25, 2013, a Saturday, was supposed to be the big day when he received his university diploma. However, Instead of being the joyous occasion he had planned, the day turned into a heartbreaking moment that would change his life forever. While the McDermott family was preparing for Donald's graduation, an emergency call was placed from their home to 911. Johanna called the police and admitted that she had shot her husband. She insisted that the act was intentional, not an accident. Police quickly arrived at the McDermott family home. Sergeant Greg Kean of the Raleigh County Sheriff's Office was one of the first law enforcement officers to arrive. When he got to the scene, he noticed that Johanna appeared to be in a state of severe shock. As he entered the home, he found Mark lying motionless on the couch in the living room. He appeared to have been reading a book when he died. Initially, Sergeant Greg noticed that he had 2 gunshot wounds to the head. However, when investigators moved the body, they discovered a 3rd wound behind the shoulder. The medical examiner at the scene confirmed that the cause of death was head injuries, but it was possible that Mark did not die immediately after being shot. There was a lot of blood at the crime scene, suggesting that Mark had been losing blood over time before his death. According to initial reports, Donald was taking a shower to prepare for his important day. The sound of the running water from the shower drowned out the gunshots. So Donald did not hear Johanna shoot her stepfather. It was only when Donald emerged from the shower that he discovered Mark's body in the living room. On the dining room table was a pistol and a letter, presumably written by Johanna to Donald's son. In the letter, Johanna expressed her grief and explained that her marriage had become unbearable. She could no longer live with a man she did not love anymore. Johanna also apologized for leaving Donald's life when he was still a minor. At that time, Johanna and Donald were taken to the Raleigh County Sheriff's Office in a private car, where a police officer took their statements. Since Johanna was the one who called the police, the incident was initially treated as a serious case of domestic violence. In the call to the dispatcher, Johanna stated that after an argument with Mark, she had shot him in the head with a pistol in a fit of rage without realizing what she was doing. However, she later changed her story, denying what she had said before. This caught the police by surprise and forced them to adjust the entire investigation. After getting into the police car, Johanna suddenly revealed the truth that it was not her, but her son Donald who killed Mark. However, this was just the tip of the iceberg. The story was actually much more complicated than what the investigators initially thought. Johanna entered the interrogation room and met with Captain James Barr from the Raleigh County Sheriff's Office. She detailed the events that had occurred on May 25, 2013. According to Johanna, her son was scheduled to attend his graduation that morning. Before that, she had gone out to run some errands and buy groceries. Johanna had just arrived home and was about to get out of the car when Donald approached her. He asked his mother to close her eyes and follow him into the house, saying that there was a surprise. Trusting her son, Johanna complied and walked into the dining room. Donald told his mother to sit down. Suddenly, Johanna heard a distinct clicking sound. When she opened her eyes to look at her son, she was horrified to see Donald pointing his own pistol at her. The gun failed to fire, and Johanna panicked, trying to wrestle it from her son. She tried to calm down, think clearly, and make a plan to save herself from becoming Donald's victim. Seeing Mark's body, she quickly told her son that she would call 911 and take the blame for him. Although Donald was initially skeptical, he eventually agreed to his mother's plan. During her interrogation, Johanna explained why she called 911 and incriminated herself. She did so to protect herself from Donald, even though she knew she would go to jail. She believed that if she did not, Donald would kill her. Johanna expressed shock that her son would point the gun at her head and pull the trigger, something she never thought would happen in her 23 years of being a mother. The gun belonged to her. She explained that the reason the gun did not fire was probably because Donald had pulled the trigger of the semi-automatic gun too far. preventing it from firing normally. Captain James thought Johanna's story was very plausible. From the moment he met Donald, he felt something was wrong. He noticed that Donald, a 23-year-old young man, was too calm for this serious situation. His face always remained neutral, showing no emotion. Therefore, he decided to put him in a separate interrogation room, away from his mother. From the beginning of the interrogation, Donald denied any involvement in his stepfather's death. However, after being informed of Johanna's testimony, his denial quickly collapsed. James did not need to use any threats or pressure to force Donald to confess. Instead, he voluntarily recounted the whole incident, revealing every detail of the case. The story Donald told was almost unbelievable. This story begins after Donald completed his first year of college. It was clear that his academic performance was not good, and due to his low grades, he decided to drop out of school. Donald shared that at first, his courses were easy and he could get good grades just by showing up to class on time. As the semester progressed, he encountered more and more difficulties in his studies. He felt that he was not capable of continuing. Instead of admitting the truth, he decided to lie to Mark and Johanna. Not only were his close friends deceived, but his girlfriend and her family were also unaware of his true situation. According to Rachel Rush, Donald's girlfriend's sister, he created a false impression that he was studying. Donald maintained a student-like schedule, leaving and returning home at fixed times. He spent most of the day in his room and asked not to be disturbed, citing the need to focus on homework or studying for exams. To create a more convincing appearance, Donald even falsified his transcripts. This was a deliberate deception that lasted for 4.5 years. No one in Donald's life realized that he was lying to them. Donald's family trusted him completely during the time he pretended to be a student. Johanna and Mark had no idea that their son had abused the financial and emotional support they had given him all this time. Donald admitted that he had no intention of deceiving his family at first, but as time went on, it became more and more difficult to confess the truth. The main reason he could not tell the truth was because he was afraid that Mark and Johanna would stop paying for all his expenses. Although he appeared to not care much about material things like cars or expensive clothes, he did not want to give up his current lifestyle. He was well aware that he would lose a lot if his parents found out the truth. For a long time, Donald had been meticulously planning to escape all trouble. From the beginning, he had planned to kill his parents to avoid suspicion. Donald planned to leave a note similar to the one found on the dining table along with the pistol. He believed that when the police read the note, they would conclude that this was the crime of an unhappy woman who saw no other way but to kill herself. Donald told Captain James that on May 25th, he had secretly taken Johanna's pistol and kept it with him all day, pretending to be preparing for his graduation ceremony. Before carrying out the rest of his plan, he decided to go to the supermarket to have his image recorded by the surveillance cameras, in order to use this evidence to prove his innocence. Before the murder, Donald had begun to show an interest in shooting practice. Although his best friend Alex Willis found this strange, Alex did not suspect anything as he did not think Donald would want to use a gun to attack someone. Donald's considerations and conclusions left everyone who heard them afterwards confused. James shared that this young man admitted that he had even planned the emotions he would express on his face when the police arrived at the scene. He also thought about how he would support himself after losing the steady income provided by Mark, and decided to take advantage of the sympathy of his loved ones as long as he could. While his family supported him, he decided to take up sports to improve his health and fitness. If he had no other choice, he would consider joining the police force or the army. When considering the possibility of his plan succeeding, Donald realized that it would be easier to kill his mother and stepfather than to admit that he had been lying to them for nearly 5 years. In April 2016, the West Virginia Supreme Court released a legal opinion. According to the opinion, Donald was charged with first-degree murder and attempted murder 1 month after his arrest in June 2013. Even before the trial, Donald and his legal team sought to delay the trial. A few weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, the defendant, Donald Dunn, who had been held in solitary confinement, underwent surgery on his right hand. His attorneys used the surgery as a reason to request a delay, arguing that during the initial hearings, he would be under the influence of strong painkillers. To decide this issue, the court first requested his medical records. However, this request was denied on the grounds that, at the preliminary hearing, there was no evidence that Donald was partially incapacitated due to the use of painkillers. Therefore, the court determined that he was competent to attend trial and approved the continuation of the scheduled trial. The trial took place in August 2014, over a year after Mark's death. It was presided over by Judge John Hutchinson, with David White representing Donald and Christine Keller from the Raleigh County Prosecutor's Office. Mark's two sisters, along with one of their nieces, traveled more than 15,000 kilometers from Australia to attend the trial of the man they had considered a family member for nearly 20 years. Although there were no details from witness testimony or evidence presented to the jury, and no photographs or video footage, the defense wanted to include in their opening argument that Donald was under the influence of illegal drugs at the time of the crime. However, there was no evidence that this had ever been mentioned before or confirmed by any toxicology tests. On August 14, 2014, Donald Dunn was convicted of the murder of his stepfather, Mark McDermott, the attempted murder of his mother, Johanna McDermott, and the use of a firearm. About a month later, on September 5 of the same year, Judge John Hutchinson sentenced Donald Dunn to life in prison without parole for the murder of his stepfather and 15 years in prison for the attempted murder of his mother. After the verdict was announced, Johanna read an emotional letter to the court. In the letter, Donald's mother mentioned that something unfortunate had happened in her son's life. This could have been due to the decline in health of his grandparents, the pressure she put on him to go to college, or his exposure to violent video games at a very young age. She expressed her disapproval of the way her son was perceived by the public and stated that she did not agree with his sentence. However, Judge John explained that Johanna's objections did not affect his decision. He felt that the sentence he imposed was the only way to restore justice in an unjust situation. He sympathized with the defendant's mother, who, despite the circumstances, wanted to protect her son from the consequences of his actions. After the verdict, Mark's sister and father still could not understand how Donald could take the life of a man who had raised him as his own son for 19 years. Hey detectives! Welcome back. We've got another mysterious case to explore. The case of Jessica Dishon. Jessica Dishon was born on May 2, 1982, in the small town of Shepherdsville, Kentucky, USA. It was a quiet place where many residents made their living from farming and were very close to one another. Jessica had two younger brothers, Christopher and Michael. From a young age, she helped her parents, Mike and Edna, take care of them while they were at work. This made Jessica more independent, and her parents could always count on her. When she was 15, she started working part-time at a local restaurant, saving money to buy her first car. She dreamed of owning a red Pontiac, and after a few years, she had saved enough money to make this dream come true. Despite her part-time job, Jessica still achieved very good academic results and began planning to go to college to become an accountant. In the fall of 1999, when Jessica was 17, she entered her senior year and started dating a boy, which made her very excited. On the morning of Friday, September 10th, as usual, Jessica's parents went to work while she was still sleeping, and her younger brothers went to the bus stop and then to school. Jessica stayed home and was supposed to drive to school by herself. However, right after her brothers left, around noon, her mother, Edna, returned home and immediately noticed something strange. Jessica's car was parked in front of the house, even though she was supposed to be in class at that time. Edna went to Jessica's room, guessing that she might have overslept and not gone to school. However, Jessica was not in her bedroom. Edna then thought that, for some reason, Jessica might have asked her father, Mike, to drive her to school. She immediately called Mike, but he said he had gone to work alone that morning. Edna suspected that there was a problem with Jessica's car, so she took the spare key to try to start it. However, as she approached the car, she noticed a few disturbing things. The driver's door was slightly open. Jessica's cell phone was on the seat with the numbers 9 and 1 displayed on the screen, and under the front seat were a pair of shoes and her keys. In the back seat were her textbooks, work clothes, and purse. Edna immediately worried that the worst could have happened. It was clear that someone had tried to call 911 from Jessica's phone but couldn't get through. Furthermore, Jessica couldn't have left all her belongings in the car and left unexpectedly. Her family lived in the suburbs, so she would have had to walk several miles. Jessica's parents called the school and learned that she had missed class. However, the school did not notify them as they should have. A few hours later, Jessica's best friend from the place where they both worked called her parents, saying that Jessica had not shown up for her shift, which made them even more worried. Worried about Jessica's absence from school and work, as well as her belongings, including her phone with the 9 and 1 dial displayed being left in an unlocked car. Her parents decided to call the police. However, the sheriff simply assumed that Jessica might have wandered off and would eventually return home. He did not notice that one of her shoes was left in the car, making it difficult for her to travel far without it. Jessica's parents tried to convince the sheriff that their daughter might be in danger, but despite their pleas, he refused to open an investigation, leaving them with no choice but to return home. After that, her parents took it upon themselves to search for her and contact acquaintances, but no one had any information about her. The next day, her parents returned to the sheriff and reported that Jessica had not returned home. This time, the police went to check Jessica's car but found another problem. The officers had searched the car without gloves, touching everything inside with their bare hands. They also did not follow standard procedure for checking Jessica's room. Jessica's parents, once again frustrated with the lack of professionalism from law enforcement, so sought the help of local media to draw attention to their daughter's disappearance and the police's lack of concern. Together with relatives and friends, they searched on their own and distributed flyers with information about Jessica. The search was led by Jessica's father and his brother, who were familiar with the area. Fearing the worst, they decided to search near a local river. The area had a bad reputation as it was dense, isolated, and popular with drug dealers and other criminals. For hours, Jessica's relatives searched the difficult terrain along the river but found no trace of her. The next morning, something unusual happened. Jessica's parents were at home, and their son was playing in the yard. Suddenly, the boy ran into the house, saying he heard a cry for help that sounded like his sister's. Jessica's father immediately grabbed the shotgun and ran outside to find the source of the cry. At the same time, his brother drove up to the house to join the search. Not long after, they noticed smoke coming from the property of their neighbor, a 40-year-old man named David Brooks. When they approached, they saw him burning something on the ground, which looked very suspicious. Jessica's father asked David for permission to search his farm. However, David refused and asked them to leave. It was not just David's strange behavior that was noteworthy. Before Jessica's disappearance, her family had maintained a normal relationship with David and his family. However, after Jessica went missing, David began to act strangely. He often drove slowly past Jessica's family's house and stared at them with a disturbing expression. Additionally, Jessica's parents received strange phone calls from a man who only panted without saying anything. Jessica's family suspected David might have had something to do with their daughter's disappearance, but they could not understand why he was behaving so oddly. Jessica's parents decided to contact the police again, despite having previously failed to get significant attention from the agency. They shared their observations, urged the officers to search David's property with dogs, and agreed to use Jessica's clothes to search for clues. The dogs led them to a fire pit on David's property, but they found no significant evidence. However, they did discover a pair of black gloves in one of the sheds, which indicated the presence of an odor associated with decomposition. Despite David's suspicious behavior, the police were still unable to connect him to Jessica's disappearance, and once again, they came up empty-handed. Frustrated with the local police, Jessica's father decided to contact the FBI. While the FBI typically did not investigate if only based on calls from relatives of missing persons, they decided to get involved immediately due to the disturbing facts presented by Jessica's parents. After a careful investigation, the FBI concluded that something truly terrible might have happened to Jessica. From this point on, a real investigation began, one that the local police had been reluctant to conduct. FBI agents collected fingerprints from Jessica's room and car, seized all potential evidence for analysis, and sent it to the lab. They also organized an extensive ground search using helicopters and gathered volunteers. Additionally, they thoroughly examined the bottom of the pond near Jessica's house, considering the possibility that her body might be there. FBI agents conducted a thorough search of David's farm and found a printed photo of Jessica. After this discovery, detectives were almost certain that David was involved in her disappearance. They also suspected his 35-year-old brother, Joseph, because he acted strangely while police were searching his property. Although investigators did not find enough evidence to arrest the brothers, they focused their efforts on thoroughly searching the area, as it was becoming increasingly likely that Jessica was no longer alive. On September 27, 17 days after Jessica went missing, police received a call from a woman driving along the road near where Jessica's father had been searching for her. The woman had seen a strange object near a tree on the side of the road and decided to check it out. The woman was shocked to discover it was a body. She immediately called the police. The FBI arrived at the scene and confirmed that the body was that of a young woman who was missing several fingers and toes. She had been bound with a rope that had traces of red and silver paint on her feet, and some of her clothing was also missing, suggesting that she had been sexually assaulted. Unfortunately, the state of decomposition of the body made it difficult to identify the victim. The police went to Jessica's home and asked her parents to assist in the identification process. Jessica's father was unable to look directly at body, but her mother agreed to do so. When she arrived at the scene, Edna initially could not identify her. However, Edna later noticed a small butterfly tattoo on the body that was identical to her daughter's and located in the same spot. Medical professionals later confirmed the deceased's identity as Jessica Dishon and determined that her cause of death was strangulation. Several bruises were also found on her body. The autopsy revealed that she had been alive for about 3 days after her disappearance, as her legs, arms, and fingers were still intact. This indicated that the police had a chance to save her, but they did not take any action to do so. After Jessica's body was discovered, the FBI decided to re-interview David. In the first interview, David claimed to have seen Jessica near her home on the morning she went missing. However, in a subsequent interview, he changed his story, stating that he had not seen her at all that day. He then claimed that he had been home in bed with his wife that morning. When detectives questioned David's wife, she contradicted his account. The FBI continued to question David, asking him what he would do if they found his fingerprints on the victim's body, even though no such evidence was discovered. David's response was suspicious. He said he would have to confess everything in that case. He subsequently failed a polygraph test, prompting the FBI to arrest him and proceed with trial. Although no solid evidence linked David to the murder, there were troubling circumstantial signs of his involvement, and the likelihood of a guilty verdict remained relatively low. Investigators continued to seek additional evidence as they prepared for trial. They recalled finding a rope similar to the one used to bind the victim's legs during a search of David's car. However, no DNA was found on it, making it an inconclusive piece of evidence. The trial began in January 2003, and David's attorney argued that there was insufficient evidence to convict his client. During the investigation, authorities discovered several missing body parts of the victim near the scene. They placed the parts in special containers and turned them over to local police, provide the requirement to keep them in a refrigerator. However, they left the containers at room temperature, which caused the parts to decompose quickly. Because the DNA and other evidence against David were not strong enough and the jury could not reach a unanimous decision, he was released. Under state law, he could only be charged again if new evidence was found. For Jessica's parents, this was a devastating blow. They were almost certain that David was the culprit behind their daughter's death. Furthermore, if the police had taken their job more seriously, their daughter might have been saved. Ultimately, they lost all hope for justice. In the years that followed, the case remained unsolved and gradually faded from memory. In 2012, a new detective, Lynn Hunt, joined the local police department. She was assigned to investigate cold cases, initially focusing on the murder of Jessica Dishon. When she reviewed the case files, she was shocked by the negligence of her predecessors. Most of the documents were filled with errors, lacked references to conversations with interested parties, and the evidence was not properly documented. The case had been handled so inefficiently that she had to start the investigation from scratch, although already 13 years after the murder. Lynn's first step was to contact Jessica's family. One of Jessica's brothers, now grown and living on his own, gave Lynn a box of Jessica's belongings that had been taken from her car. He had kept it since the police returned the items to the family. Lynn was once again confronted with her colleagues' poor handling of evidence, as it had not been properly stored. Although, after all these years, these items were unlikely to help her, she persisted in examining everything she could find. Through her research, she discovered information about David's medical examination results, which showed that his IQ was only 61, extremely low. This raised concerns about police operations, particularly regarding the questioning of him. Based on his significantly low IQ, he may not have fully understood the questions and may have given incomplete answers. This could indicate that he may not have been involved in the case, as his unusual behavior could be explained by his extremely low IQ. After a thorough investigation of everyone involved or living near the scene, nearly 15 years after Jessica's death, a colleague from another department called Lynn and shared new information from an inmate at the Kentucky State Prison who claimed to know the true identity of Jessica's killer. Lynn approached this lead with skepticism because, many times, when inmates try to provide information to the police, the end result is often frustration and wasted time. Many of them make up stories in hopes of getting released early or improving their prison conditions. However, she understood that this lead could not be ignored without verification. She visited the prison and met a man who was said to have relevant information. According to the man, he had shared a cell with a convicted child molester, the same crime as him. They became friends and exchanged details about their crimes. One day, the inmate told him that he had killed Jessica. The informant then revealing the man's name. It was Stanley Dish, Jessica's uncle and her father's younger brother. According to the informant, Stanley had confessed that he had sexually abused Jessica for years while they lived in the same household. Stanley had threatened to kill Jessica or her relatives if she spoke out. In the spring of 1999, when Jessica had a boyfriend, Stanley began to fear that she would eventually reveal her abuse by him. On the morning of September 10th, Stanley went to Jessica's home while she was alone. Jessica was getting into her car to leave when Stanley asked her to break up with her boyfriend. Jessica refused and threatened to report him if he did not leave her alone. When he refused, Stanley began to threaten Jessica. She tried to call 911, but Stanley grabbed her. Eventually, Jessica broke free and ran into the house. Stanley chased her down, beat her, then tied her up with bed sheets and took her to a nearby abandoned warehouse, where she was later found dead. Stanley held her captive for a long time, torturing and mentally abusing her before killing her. He then moved her body to a visible location near the road and buried it beneath the warehouse. He also claimed that after the murder, he had dismembered some of her body parts, hoping to deceive the police into thinking it was a drug deal gone wrong. Detective Lynn realized that information about the dismembered body parts had never been made public. Only Jessica's closest friends knew about it, so the informant could not have made this up. Finally, the man added that Stanley had buried Jessica's shoe under a broken tree near the shed. Lynn decided to verify all this information by searching for evidence. However, the local police station was short-staffed, so no one there could help her. She contacted Jessica's brother and a few other relatives, who agreed to join the search. She didn't tell them that Stanley might be the killer because she wanted to find some evidence to support these shocking accusations first. On the first day, they didn't find any clues in the heavy rain. They dug in areas that matched the description, but to no avail. The next day, Jessica's brother and Lynn returned to the scene. On the way, he showed her an abandoned shed on the side of the road. They went there and started digging inside, and almost immediately found a significant breakthrough. They discovered a buried bedsheet. Lynn collected this evidence and quickly went to Jessica's house. Over the years, Jessica's room had been kept exactly as it had been when her missing. Thanks to this, Lynn was able to confirm that the bedsheet found was part of Jessica's bedding, as it was not on the bed, and the other linens had the same pattern. Shortly after the evidence was discovered, Stanley was arrested and questioned. Although he appeared very nervous during the interrogation, he still refused to admit to the crime. He was eventually charged with murder, and the case went to trial. Jessica's father, Mike, could not believe that his own brother would commit such a cruel act against his daughter. He went through a period of complete denial but eventually accepted this unbearable truth. He recalled that in the early days of Jessica's disappearance, it was Stanley who suggested searching for the body near the riverbank. However, during the search, he suddenly felt nauseous and was taken home by his brother. It turned out that this incident occurred just a few hundred meters from the warehouse where Jessica lived, suggesting that Stanley had deliberately distracted them from searching for her while she was still alive. During the preparation for the trial, Detective Lynn carefully researched Stanley's past. She discovered that he had a previous conviction for assaulting another girl in the family. In addition, several other women reported that he had sexually abused them when they were children. He often took advantage of his relationship to stay at the victims' homes, then committed the crimes by threatening them not to speak out. The police concluded that he had committed these acts over a period of 3 decades. However, Detective Lynn found that securing a murder conviction would be difficult due to the lack of direct evidence such as fingerprints or DNA. She dug deeper into the case and stumbled upon an old box of files that had not been examined. When she looked through the contents, she was shocked again by the incompetence of those who had originally handled the case. The box contained a letter dated June 26, 2002, in which another informant had written to the police with the same story that Lynn had only heard 12 years later from a Kentucky inmate. In the summer of 2002, Stanley had been convicted of assaulting an underage relative. During that time, he had told a fellow inmate, who happened to be a police informant, about killing Jessica. The fellow inmate had written a letter to the department handling the case, revealing the gruesome details of what Stanley had done to his niece. The police simply ignored the letter and, perhaps believing that David had been involved all those years ago, did not consider other suspects. Lynn was frustrated by the lack of professionalism from her colleagues. had they paid more attention to their work. The case might have been solved in 2002. For years, Jessica's family could only wait for the trial, hoping that Stanley would finally face the justice that had been delayed for his actions. The case began in 2015, and Stanley proclaimed his innocence. In court, Jessica's parents could barely look at the relative who had destroyed their lives. They were also furious that he would not admit to his actions to help them gain closure. The prosecution was concerned that the chances of securing a conviction for murder were slim, mainly due to the lack of substantial evidence. They were also worried about the charges of assault against the other girls in the family, as these witnesses would have to come to court and describe Stanley's behavior toward them in detail. To clarify, the prosecutor negotiated a plea deal with Stanley. Under the terms of the deal, the death penalty would be waived if Stanley pleaded guilty to the assault on his relative and to Jessica's murder. Stanley agreed to the deal, however. Part of the agreement stipulated that he did not have to reveal any further details about the crime. Jessica's parents were unhappy about this, as they wanted to know the whole truth. In the end, Stanley was sentenced to 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Stanley was sentenced at the age of 56 and could have been released at the age of 71. After the trial, Jessica's father stated that if his brother hadn't died in prison, he would have waited for him to figure things out for himself. In 2019, Stanley gave his first interview and insisted that he did not kill Jessica. He claimed he was on his way to work that morning, but 2 decades later, he couldn't prove it. He could not explain why 2 independent informants had similar stories, including details only the killer would know, such as where the bedsheets were buried. David Brooks stated that police had not ruled out his involvement in the case. Stanley, who knew him, may have asked for his help in disposing of the victim's belongings. Due to his low IQ, Brooks may not have understood the full extent of the situation. It is possible that he burned Jessica's clothes in a fire, and that Stanley gave him gloves that had a scent detectable by dogs. However, the truth may never be revealed, as Brooks passed away in 2021 due to heart problems. On the 3rd day after Jessica went missing, her younger brother heard screams outside and thought it was his sister calling for help. However, it is impossible to say for certain what happened at that time. Jessica could still be alive, but Stanley might have kept her in a shed a few miles from her home. In this case, it is more likely that the child imagined the incident due to stress or that someone else was screaming. However, there is another theory, although it seems unlikely. We know that shortly after Jessica's father rushed out, Stanley drove up to the house, which indicates he was nearby. Therefore, it is possible that the girl was in his car with her mouth covered or unconscious. In spite of this hypothesis appears very unlikely. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Rowan Ford. Rowan Ford was born on April 11, 1998, in San Diego, California. When she was young, her parents divorced, and her mother, Colleen, moved with her to a small town called Stella, Missouri. Colleen later met a man named David, and they married. Colleen already had several children from a previous marriage, and soon after their marriage, she and David had a daughter together. Rowan has 2 older sisters and 2 older brothers, and they are very close. She enjoys spending time outdoors, biking around town, swimming, and pursuing her passion for painting. She also enjoys attending Sunday school at her local church, where she often volunteers to help children who are having trouble with their homework. In November 2007, when Rowan was 9 years old, she was in 4th grade at her local elementary school. Her mother worked the night shift at a store, while her stepfather was often at the farm during the day. As a result, Rowan was often left to fend for herself, which helped her become very independent. On November 2nd, she was home alone, as usual. Colleen went to work, and her stepfather had not yet returned from the farm. The next morning, Around 9 o'clock, Colleen returned home from her night shift and checked Rowan's room, but her daughter was not there. She asked her husband if he knew where Rowan was, and he told her that Rowan had asked him if she could stay the night at a friend's house. He agreed without asking the friend's name, since their town was small and he wasn't worried about her safety. Colleen felt worried and decided to ask all of Rowan's friends. Since their town only had a few streets, this didn't take long. However, none of Rowan's friends had seen her, and she had not spent the night at any of their homes. This made her mother even more anxious. Colleen searched all over town but could not find her daughter. She finally returned home and told her husband that Rowan was missing. She asked him to contact the police to report the incident, but he assured her that everything was fine and that Rowan would be home soon. After waiting for a few more hours without seeing Rowan, Colleen decided to call 911 and take matters into her own hands. The local sheriff immediately organized a search operation. He went to Colleen's house to interview David, the last person to see Rowan before she disappeared. David said that he had been working on the farm with his co-worker Christopher that evening when Nathan, a mutual friend of theirs, came to visit. They decided to go to David's house to drink and play pool. They stopped by the store to buy some alcohol before heading to David's house, where they stayed for a few hours. That night, Christopher asked Nathan to drive him to a nearby town to pick up car. They convinced David to join them to continue their party. Before leaving the house, Christopher checked to see if Rowan was asleep in her room and found her already asleep. After David left with his friends, they stopped at a store to buy more alcohol and then went to Christopher's trailer, where they continued drinking for about an hour. David then decided to go home and asked Nathan for a ride. Nathan agreed but chose to take a detour rather than the highway, as he was quite drunk and did not want to get in trouble with the police. Nathan dropped David off and drove home, while David went straight to bed. Shortly after, Rowan woke him up and asked if she could stay the night at a friend's house. Without thinking much of it, he agreed and fell asleep. The police approached the case with suspicion. What puzzled them most was that a 9-year-old girl would decide to go to a friend's house in the middle of the night, especially since her stepfather had not asked about the friend she was visiting. The police chief suspected that David might be hiding something or had something to do with Rowan's disappearance, but there was no evidence to support this suspicion. The police searched the town and the surrounding area until late at night. Locals quickly joined the search because they knew the Rowan family and wanted to help. Stella had a population of only about 150, so news of Rowan's disappearance spread rapidly throughout the area. Locals usually felt safe letting their children play outside, as there was not much going on in such a peaceful place. However, when Rowan disappeared without a trace and the police could not find her throughout the day, the people of Stella became extremely panicked. On the first day of the search, nothing was found. Then, on November 4th, the police went to the neighboring town and spoke to Christopher, who confirmed David's story. However, Christopher added that his friend had not contacted him since that evening, and he had only learned of Rowan's disappearance that same day. The police expanded the search and brought in more volunteers, but they still could not find Rowan or any clues regarding her whereabouts. The next morning, the FBI joined the investigation while local police continued to search for Rowan in the area around town. Detectives focused on the possibility of kidnapping. They strongly doubted the David story, as it seemed very suspicious. The police also checked with all of Rowan's friends and confirmed that she had not visited any of them that night. Investigators interviewed David several times, and his testimony varied in detail, further raising suspicions about his involvement. For example, he provided different times for being away that night and even stated that Rowan may not have asked him before going to visit a friend. FBI agents further discovered that on the night of her missing, David had asked his mother to lend him her car, although he had not initially disclosed this to the police. As a result, The police seized both cars for testing, but experts found no evidence. Detectives continued discussions with Christopher and Nathan, as both were with David that night. Christopher was invited to the police station and told the same story as the day before. He also agreed to take a polygraph test, which showed no signs of deception. A few hours after Christopher left the station and returned to work, he saw Chief Clark's car. Christopher signaled for Chief Clark to stop. Sheriff Clark is the police chief in the town of Whitton and has known Christopher for 17 years, since Christopher was a child. Clark was a friend of Christopher's adoptive parents, and Christopher had always respected him. He often turned to him for advice or help in times of trouble. Sheriff Clark contacted Christopher, and they discussed Rowan's disappearance. Clark was aware of the case but was not directly involved, as the search was being handled by the Stella Police Department. During their conversation, Clark suspected that Christopher was withholding information, as Rowan's life was in danger and her fate was still uncertain. Therefore, Clark decided to share these suspicions with the FBI, contacting agents to explain his concerns. Investigators suspect that Christopher may be withholding important information about Rowan's disappearance, which could implicate her stepfather. It is possible that he asked Christopher to lie and alter some details in his account of the events of that night. Christopher now fears that he will be considered an accomplice if he tells the truth. Sheriff Clark informed the FBI agents that he had a good and trusting relationship with Christopher, so he wanted to help convince him to share information. That same day, Christopher went to Colleen's home to ask her about the progress of the search. Simultaneously, the FBI agents also visited Rowan's mother again. When they met with Christopher, they continued to ask him a few questions, and he once again confirmed that the events of that night happened exactly as he had described them. However, this time he also mentioned that he did not rule out the possibility that David was involved in Rowan's disappearance and expressed his desire to help them find the truth, no matter how frightening it might be. He suggested wearing a wiretap and approaching David to try to get him to confess. However, the detectives decided not to use such tactics. Instead, they asked Christopher if he could think of any locations where his friend might have hidden Rowan's body, and he suggested several places. The next day, the police began investigating these locations while continuing to search the area around Stella's house. FBI agents once again brought David in for questioning, but he repeatedly denied any involvement. Detectives also searched David's house in the hope of finding clues, but nothing was discovered. On November 7th, the police asked Christopher to return to the station to obtain his consent to search the safe in David's home. Christopher had been living with David for several months due to not having his own place, and some of his belongings were still there. Christopher gave the police permission to search the safe, his trailer, and his car. He also voluntarily provided a DNA sample and agreed to answer additional questions from the detectives. They began questioning him that evening and again asked him to confirm David's story. This time, however, Christopher suddenly admitted that his friend's story was not entirely true. The investigators began to pressure him to tell them what really happened. This pressure caused Christopher to become agitated. He said that if the police were going to treat him like a criminal and try to implicate him in Rowan's disappearance, he would not continue the conversation. The detectives then had to end the interview, and Christopher left the station. That night, he went to see Chief Clark and told him the whole story. He complained that the detectives were treating him as a suspect and said that he might need to hire a lawyer. The chief replied that it was his right, but asked him to understand that the police were only doing what they could to find Rowan. In response, Christopher stated that he would not speak to them anymore and that if he wanted to share any more information, he would only speak to Sheriff Clark. He continued to persuade Christopher to share what he knew. After a while, Christopher began to cry and said that he had always loved Rowan and would never hurt her. During his time living in David's house, Christopher developed a close relationship with Rowan and the other children. They began to consider him a member of the family and even called him Uncle Christopher. Sheriff Clark realized that Christopher was about to reveal everything he knew. However, just as Christopher was about to share, someone came to the police station, causing Sheriff Clark to temporarily lose focus. Christopher then left the office without revealing what he was about to say. Sheriff Clark eventually contacted the FBI and informed them about the conversation. He explained that Christopher was willing to share most of what he knew, but warned that if he was pressed too hard, Christopher might refuse to talk and seek legal counsel. Clark offered to give Christopher time to think it over, and the detectives agreed. The search for Rowan continued the next day without success. However, the situation changed on November 9th, a week after Rowan went missing. Search parties found Rowan's body in a remote area near a town called Powell, about 10 miles from where Stella lived. The body was covered in leaves and debris, with only a sock remaining. Medical examiners determined that Rowan had been strangled and sexually assaulted. Shortly after the body was discovered, FBI agents contacted Chief Clark and asked him to speak with Christopher again, hoping he would reveal more information. The chief learned that Christopher had come to the police station earlier that morning when Chief Clark was not there and had informed other officers that he urgently needed to see him. The chief searched everywhere for Christopher but could not find him. Christopher then contacted Chief Clark himself. He expressed obvious distress and concern that he was being followed. He explained that after hearing about the discovery of Rowan's body, he had driven around town to calm down and had noticed a gray car following him. Chief Clark claimed to be unaware of any surveillance activity and asked to meet Christopher directly. When Christopher met with the investigators, he expressed concern for his safety. He feared that after the discovery of Rowan's body, he might be charged with murder and that someone would take revenge on him. Clark took him to the police station and explained that now that the case had been ruled a murder, it was time for him to reveal everything he knew. Christopher began to cry. The sheriff asked him to tell him what David had done to Rowan. Christopher said that there were too many people at the police station and that he did not want to discuss it there. He suggested going to a quieter place and mentioned a small bridge a few miles from their town. The sheriff agreed, and they drove there together. As they got out of the car, Christopher suddenly raised his hands and asked the police to handcuff him. The sheriff was surprised and said that it was unnecessary, but Christopher insisted that after what he had said, the police had to do so. Christopher then began to recount the story he had told the police many times. He went to his trailer with Nathan and David, where they continued drinking. After a while, his friends decided to go home, and David asked Nathan to drive them. They said they would take a detour to avoid the police. However, Christopher then suddenly announced that he wanted to sexually assault Rowan and that he planned to do so. Knowing that it would take his friends a long time to take a detour through the fields, he drove straight to David's house on the main highway. He then barged into Rowan's room, picked her up, and carried her to his car, intending not to wake her. Christopher then took Rowan to his trailer, where he assaulted her. According to Christopher, Rowan had just woken up and tried to resist but was unable to escape. Christopher did not turn on the lights or talk to Rowan because he did not want her to recognize him. After committing this act, Christopher intended to take Rowan home and leave. But the plan did not go as intended. When Christopher carried Rowan out of the trailer, the moon was shining brightly, and Rowan saw Christopher's face clearly. Panicking, Christopher grabbed a rope and strangled her. When she died, he loaded her body into the car and began to think about what to do next. Initially, he wanted to throw her off the bridge, the same bridge where he stood with Sheriff Clark, but he realized her body would be found too quickly. So, he got into the driver's seat and started driving around the county, considering other options. Soon, he remembered a large pit near a neighboring town and headed there. He threw the victim's body into the pit and tried to cover it with branches, but the pit was too large to cover completely. When he returned to the car, he noticed traces of Rowan's blood on his clothes and the mattress. Christopher realized he needed to get rid of the pants, underwear, and rope used to kill the victim. He gathered all of these items and planned to put them in a large barrel to burn. However, Christopher quickly realized that such a fire would certainly attract attention, so he dragged the barrel into the shed, closed the door, and set it on fire. Sheriff Clark was surprised by this story. He had previously believed that David had committed the crime and that Christopher was just hiding some information. It was hard to believe that a man he had known for nearly 20 years could be so brutal. Christopher had 3 young children, and although he had not lived with them since his divorce, he had always seemed like a nice man. But the truth was much colder. After Christopher finished telling his story, he voluntarily went to the police station. The sheriff did not handcuff him. It was only after they arrived and the man repeated his confession to the FBI agents that he was arrested for murder. Christopher also signed a voluntary consent form to allow his trailer and car to be searched. He eventually said that he regretted his actions and cried like a baby all the next day. Investigators went to inform David that Christopher had confessed to the murder. Based on David's behavior and inconsistent statements, they suspected that he might have been protecting his friend. However, they discovered something even more shocking. When brought in for questioning, David changed his testimony of events. According to David's testimony, when he came home and found Rowan not in her room, he suspected that Christopher might have kidnapped her. So he took his mother's car and drove to Christopher's trailer. When David entered the trailer, he found her lying on the bed with Christopher. Instead of saving Rowan, David decided to join in and bully her as well. David then helped his friend dispose of the body. He stated that throughout the incident, he was shocked and could not remember anything that happened. The detectives, who were initially surprised by this incident, contacted Christopher again to confirm David's statement. However, Christopher insisted that his friend was not involved and that everything happened exactly as he had previously said. This further confused the detectives, but Christopher's statement was consistent with the facts. A medical expert confirmed that Rowan had been strangled with a thin wire, a detail that only the killer would know. During the search of the trailer, the police found a container of ashes. In addition, they found a hair in the trailer that matched Rowan's. Although investigators were unable to determine who was telling the truth, both men made accusations against one another. As a result, David was also arrested, and both cases went to trial. During the trial, Christopher requested that all of his statements be removed from the record, arguing that he did not know they could be used against him and that the police had violated his rights. However, the judge rejected this request because all of his conversations with investigators had been completely voluntary. Christopher also tried to explain the difficult circumstances of his childhood. He had experienced many family changes since he was young, which had a significant impact on his development. Christopher also saw a specialist who confirmed that he exhibited signs of developmental problems but could not help him avoid punishment. In 2012, 5 years after the murder, he was sentenced to death. He attempted to appeal the conviction but was unsuccessful. For David, the situation was much more complicated. He admitted to attacking and killing Rowan, but his testimony contradicted Christopher's. If the prosecution decided to charge David with murder, Christopher's conviction would likely be overturned, and David could also evade responsibility because there was no solid evidence against him, such as DNA. The prosecution could not afford to make such a risky claim. In fact, they were still uncertain about David's involvement in the case. They did not rule out the possibility that David had committed the crime alongside Christopher, but there was no evidence to support this theory. In the end, a difficult decision was made. To avoid the risk of overturning Christopher's conviction, They reduced David's charges to significantly lesser ones. David pleaded guilty to 2 counts, child endangerment and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison, with a minimum of 5 years to serve. Hey detectives! Welcome back. We've got another mysterious case to explore. The case of Lisa Holm. Lisa Holm was born on February 7, 1998 in a small town in Sweden. It is a peaceful place where she lives with her parents and older sister. Lisa is a kind, positive, and determined person. Even before finishing her studies, she decided that she wanted to go to Australia to study architecture. Lisa has also had a lot of experience traveling with her family, visiting many other countries. In the summer of 2015, when Lisa turned 17, she finally found her first job at a cafe about a 40-minute drive from home. During the first few weeks, her parents still drove her to work. However, not long after, her father decided to buy her a scooter so that she could get around on her own. Lisa had this type of driver's license before she turned 18, which is the age required to apply for a car driver's license. She was very happy to receive this gift because it was an opportunity for her to go to work by herself without having to rely on others. However, in the first few weeks, her father still accompanied her by car because Lisa lacked experience driving on the road. She only worked on weekends, and her father accompanied her every morning and evening. This habit continued until June 7th, when he finally allowed her to drive herself to the cafe. Around lunchtime, her parents decided to visit her at work and have lunch together. That day, the cafe was quite crowded, so Lisa was very busy with work. She took a short break to have lunch with her parents, then they returned home. At 6:23 p.m., Lisa sent a text message to her father saying that she was coming home. Just 3 minutes later, her father received a call from Lisa, but no one answered. He heard some voices in the background and thought that Lisa had accidentally called his number while talking to her colleague. He also heard the sound of a car door closing. He called Lisa's name several times, but no one answered. Then, he ended the call and started waiting for her to come home. However, she did not appear. After an hour, Lisa's parents began to worry. They thought something might have happened to her on the way since she should have arrived by now. This was the first time she had ridden a scooter alone, and her father was very concerned about her safety. He tried calling her several times, but Lisa's phone was turned off. After waiting for a while, her father decided to set off, hoping to meet Lisa on the way because she could have taken the shortest route. Her father was afraid that Lisa might have had an accident, so he drove carefully, paying attention to the road but did not see his daughter. Finally, he went to the cafe but could not find Lisa. When he arrived at her workplace, he noticed that Lisa's scooter was parked in front of the building. At that moment, he panicked because he could not find his daughter despite having come all this way. When he saw her scooter, he immediately calmed down, thinking that maybe she was just late for work for some reason. However, there was no one in the cafe, and he noticed something else. Lisa's scooter key was still in the ignition, with a helmet dangling from the handle. These things made him believe that something was wrong with his daughter. She would never leave the key in the scooter while leaving it unattended in the parking lot. Meanwhile, Lisa's mother contacted the cafe owner, hoping to find clues about her daughter's whereabouts. However, the cafe owner claimed that he did not know where Lisa was. According to the cafe owner, Lisa had called the staff around 6 p.m. and they told her that they were closing the cafe. After the call from Lisa's mother, the cafe owner immediately got in his car and went to the cafe. On the way, the cafe owner also contacted 4 friends who lived nearby, asking them to help find Lisa. When the cafe owner arrived, they began searching both the cafe and the surrounding area. They hoped that Lisa might have decided to take the bus instead of the scooter. Lisa's mother and sister drove to the bus station in their town to check the schedule. Unfortunately, Lisa was not on the bus. Her family immediately contacted the police. It was dark. The police quickly expanded the search. The fact that Lisa's motorbike was left in the parking lot with the keys made them consider the possibility that Lisa had been kidnapped. Such incidents are quite rare in Sweden, especially in the remote rural area where she lived. Therefore, the police quickly mobilized teams with sniffer dogs, while other officers began knocking on doors near the cafe. When Lisa's classmates and friends learned about her missing, they shared information about the case on social media, hoping to attract more attention and find witnesses. The search went on all night but yielded no results. On Monday morning, the police department announced Lisa's missing to the public and asked anyone with information to come forward. At the same time, a man working in a warehouse across the street from the cafe found a motorcycle glove on the floor and reported it to the police. Detectives had checked the warehouse the night Lisa went missing but did not find the glove. They later showed the glove to Lisa's parents, who confirmed that it belonged to their daughter. This further strengthened the theory that Lisa had been kidnapped, and the police intensified their search efforts. By that time, news of Lisa's missing had captured the nation's attention, and hundreds of volunteers had joined the search. On Tuesday, the police received some alarming new leads. Volunteers searched the area around a dirt road a few hundred yards from the cafe. During the investigation of the crime scene, investigators collected several pieces of evidence related to Lisa, including a phone case, a receipt, a ticket, and a broken smartphone screen. They later found other parts of the smartphone, Lisa's ID card, and several other receipts scattered along the dirt road. This evidence made the police almost certain that Lisa had been kidnapped. They mobilized every available resource for the search, and the number of participants grew. The case became a major news topic in Sweden, and hundreds of volunteers from across the country joined the search. A local missing persons organization also joined the effort. The scale of the search for Lisa became the largest in the country's modern history, with more than 1,000 people involved in total. The police received numerous calls from people with information about Lisa's missing. One woman reported that before Lisa went missing, she had gone jogging. While she was jogging, a man standing next to his car stopped her and asked for directions to a city she had never heard of. He spoke to her in English. She tried to give him directions using Google Maps, but he asked her to get in his car and show him the way using his navigation device. The woman found this request suspicious, so she refused and continued walking. She also told the police that she believed she had seen the man among the workers repairing a warehouse across from the cafe. Lisa's co-workers shared a testimony with the police. On the day of her missing, a witness noticed two men standing across from the coffee shop, looking in the direction of where she worked. The witness didn't think much of it at the time, but after Lisa went missing, they decided to share it with the police. The next day, Wednesday, Lisa's father and some friends searched the dirt road where her belongings had been found the day before. When they went a little further, they found Lisa's driver's license and house keys. This suggested that Lisa may have been abducted and forced to leave the coffee shop via this road. Her kidnapper may have thrown her belongings out of the car or other vehicle they used to abduct her. Police and volunteers focused their efforts in this area, but no other items were found. That evening, a friend of Lisa's father was returning home from his search. As he passed the coffee shop, he noticed that the police had left the warehouse where Lisa's gloves were found. The man decided to go inside the coffee shop to look for any other clues. This time, he used his car's flashlight to walk around the premises since it was dark. While there, he noticed a shiny object lying on the floor. Upon closer inspection, he realized it was a pair of women's earrings. The man later reported this to the police, who showed the earrings to Lisa's parents. They confirmed that the jewelry belonged to their daughter. The police then sealed off the shed and conducted a more thorough inspection. The lead detective explained that on the first day of the search for Lisa, the priority was to find her, so the shed had not been fully inspected, and they may have missed small items such as earrings. After conducting an in-depth investigation, forensic experts and sniffer dogs were called in. They discovered a remarkable piece of evidence hidden behind a wall, which was traces of human feces. Although it seemed unrelated to the case, forensic experts developed an hypothesis regarding it. When criminals commit serious and horrifying crimes, their bodies secrete a large amount of adrenaline, which can lead them to be unable to control their urge to urinate. This often happens to murderers, who frequently urinate before or during the crime. Based on the discovery of Lisa's gloves and earrings in the warehouse area, the police hypothesized that if she had been kidnapped, the perpetrator might have dragged her into this building. Therefore, detectives did not rule out the possibility that the kidnapper may have consumed a large amount of adrenaline, leading to an inability to control himself and necessitating urination at the scene. Consequently, fecal samples were taken and sent for DNA analysis. On Friday, the search area was expanded, and volunteers went to a farm about 3.2 kilometers from the cafe. This farm complex consisted of large buildings where many people worked. The search team decided to check the entire area. However, after they arrived, two men appeared at the farm. They spoke no Swedish and only communicated in English. One of them claimed that the police had come to the farm to check on them. But the leader of the search party did not believe him, as he thought he would be notified if it were true. So he decided to continue searching. The two men walked around the farm, observing for a while before driving away. After about an hour, the search team discovered a pile of branches behind the cowshed. Upon closer inspection, they found a motorcycle helmet, jacket, and headphones. Police quickly arrived on the scene and confirmed that these items belonged to Lisa. They then sent forensic experts to the farm to conduct a more thorough investigation. The detectives heard stories about two strange men who tried to stop volunteers from checking the farm. The police also recalled a report about a woman who had encountered a man acting suspiciously while jogging and who spoke English. In fact, they had some idea of his identity from the very beginning of the search. They visited the houses surrounding the cafe. In one of the houses, two Lithuanian brothers lived with the wife of one of them. All three of them spoke no Swedish and communicated only in English. They were the only people within a few miles who did not speak the local language. The police also had other indirect reasons to suspect them. The brothers worked at the warehouse across the street from the cafe and at the farm where Lisa's helmet was found. They were familiar with these locations and the road leading to their house. Since there were no other suspects, the police decided to question all three of them. Forensic experts, along with volunteers, went to the farm to continue the investigation. They noticed an old trailer, surrounded by tall grass, that looked like it hadn't been used in years. However, the grass around the door was flattened, indicating that something had been there recently. In addition, the grass under the door was also matted down, indicating that the door had not been opened for a long time. When the forensic experts opened the door, they were immediately hit by a strong stench of decay. Inside the trailer were several wardrobes, most of which had previously been used as changing rooms for workers. All but one were locked, leading experts to suspect that Lisa's body might be in one of them. They began opening each one and eventually discovered Lisa's body in an open cupboard, hidden behind a pile of old clothes and rags. Despite the small size of the cupboard, the perpetrator had managed to squeeze the victim inside. Lisa had been tied up with a rope around her neck and duct tape wrapped around her head. Her pants had been pulled down, and her shirt had been pulled up. Medical experts determined that Lisa had died from strangulation, but no signs of sexual assault were found. All of her clothes were turned over to the lab for testing. As news of the discovery of her body spread rapidly across the country, headlines in Sweden focused on Lisa's abduction. When her body was found and the public learned of her brutal murder, the incident shocked the entire nation. Since such crimes are extremely rare in Sweden, everyone was taken aback that someone could commit such a brutal act. On the same day her body was discovered, something unusual and quite strange happened. A YouTube user came across a video posted 13 days before the murder, titled 13, which had a countdown timer. The most disturbing detail was that the name of the channel that posted the video was Lisa. News of this video quickly spread across the media, leaving many people stunned by the coincidence. Some began to speculate that someone had predicted the murder, but the truth was much simpler. Someone had likely changed the channel name and video title after discovering Lisa's body. This could have been to suggest another conspiracy theory or just a cruel joke. The police are trying their best to quickly find the culprit in this murder. When Lisa's body was discovered, investigators brought in the owners of the farm, Narigis Belavicius, his brother and his brother's wife for questioning. However, all of them denied any involvement in the case. They claimed that at the time of the kidnapping, they were at home together to provide each other with an alibi. According to their story, Narigis was sleeping in his room while his wife was preparing dinner and Narigis' brother was on the computer. Around 8 p.m., Narigis woke up and went to the gas station to buy pizza and cigarettes. The police had some doubts about the testimony of them, as they might have been protecting each other. Although the police collected their DNA samples, investigators still did not find direct evidence linking them to the murder case. Forensic experts worked diligently at relevant locations, such as the barn and the farm, using all available resources and manpower, and their efforts finally paid off. In the barn area, there was a small room resembling an office, with a large window overlooking the cafe. When examining this room, experts discovered 15 different male semen stains on the wall and floor near the window. This suggested that someone had stood there, observing the cafe staff, including Lisa. The collected semen samples were promptly sent to the laboratory, where experts extracted DNA profiles from these samples. The results of the DNA analysis showed that all 15 semen traces matched the DNA of Narigis. Additionally, fecal samples found in the barn also matched his DNA. In the adjacent room, which had previously been used to store cow's milk, forensic experts found a pipe about 2 feet above the floor, covered in a thick layer of dust except for a small strip. The size of the strip matched the rope used to strangle Lisa. Blood was found on the pipe, and DNA analysis confirmed that the blood belonged to Narigis. On the floor near the pipe, they also found a piece of rope that matched the one on the pipe. Experts conducted tests and identified 2 DNA samples, Lisa's and Narigis's. This was an important step in the police investigation. They had connected the suspect to the rope used to kill the victim. Additionally, a strand of Lisa's hair was found in the room. Another crucial piece of evidence was Narigis's DNA found on her jacket. Based on this evidence, the police believed that Lisa had been murdered there. Police pieced together a similar sequence of events. Narigis had been observing the cafe for some time, and when Lisa was alone in the parking lot, he approached her. Based on the jogger's account, he may have pretended to ask Lisa for directions to a certain city or used some other tactic to trick her. Narigis may have then lured Lisa into his car to enter a route into the GPS system. Since Lisa was a kind person who always tried to help others, she may have agreed. Once she was in the car, the perpetrator covered her mouth and drove to a secluded place. At the scene, the perpetrator tied a rope around the victim's neck and hung her from a pipe. According to doctors, this action may have excited the perpetrator so much that he experienced an adrenaline rush, causing him to defecate on the spot. After the victim died, he placed Lisa's body in his car and drove to the farm, throwing her belongings out the window on the way. He hid the victim's body in the trailer's storage locker and covered it with old clothes. The entire process took less than an hour. Despite the overwhelming evidence, he maintained his innocence. His wife and brother were not involved and were released. They quickly left Sweden and returned to Lithuania. Preparations for the trial were intense. Narigis claimed that he had worked in that warehouse for a long time, so his DNA could have been present due to his work. Additionally, he had alibis from his wife and brother, although there were doubts about the reliability of both sources in court. This could work in his favor, although many uncertainties remained. However, the presence of Narigis's DNA on the victim's clothes could only be explained by his direct contact with her on the day of the murder. Furthermore, the police also found a witness who saw Narigis's car near the cafe just before and after Lisa's abduction. According to the witness, the car had traveled several times on the road between the cafe and the farm at a time when Narigis was believed to be asleep at home, according to his brother and his wife. After months of investigation, experts used the most advanced equipment to examine all the collected evidence. They found traces of Narigis's DNA on most of Lisa's clothing, including inside her underwear. With public interest piqued, the investigators continued to search for more clues that could influence the proceedings and strengthen Narigis's connection to the case. They traveled to Lithuania to speak with his wife and his brother again. The woman maintained that he had not left the house between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m., but when his brother was questioned, the detectives quickly obtained the information they wanted. After presenting the man with all the evidence against his brother and the details of what he had done to the 17-year-old girl, the man decided to cooperate with the police. He claimed that Narigis was not home that night, returning only around 7:30 p.m. He looked dirty and immediately washed all his clothes. As the police began questioning all the residents and visiting their homes, Narigis whispered to his brother to tell the police that he had been home during that time. Narigis later explained that he was afraid of being charged with a crime he did not commit, as he was an immigrant and had no alibi at the time of the abduction. The brother truly believed his cousin was innocent, but after hearing all the evidence, he realized that his initial thoughts might have been incorrect. Lisa's funeral took place just a month after her murder. The church where the funeral was held could only accommodate 130 people, but many more came to say goodbye to her. The organizers decided to set up extra chairs and screens outside so that everyone could watch the ceremony. The trial began 4 months after the murder and once again attracted national attention, placing everyone involved under a great deal of pressure. Narigis's lawyer claimed that his client's DNA could have been found on the victim's clothes because he had worked in the barn. However, the prosecutor argued that this explanation did not make sense, especially concerning Lisa's underwear. The only way the suspect's DNA could have ended up there would be if he had touched the victim's underwear. The lawyer was unable to produce any concrete evidence to prove his client's innocence. Instead, he theorized that the real killer was Narigis's brother. According to this theory, the brother took multiple samples of Narigis's DNA and deliberately left them on the victim's body and at the crime scene to confuse the case. But this defense was quickly dismissed. The trial lasted a month, and Narigis was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in a high-security prison. Although in Sweden, this prison offers the same amenities as a 3-star hotel. The lawyer appealed but was rejected. In early 2017, Narigis himself applied to be transferred to a prison in his home country of Lithuania for reasons that remain unclear. Lithuanian prisons are significantly worse than those in Sweden. Yet the court still accepted the defendant's request. After all, providing comfortable conditions of detention cost Swedish taxpayers hundreds of dollars per day per prisoner. That same year, Narigis appealed to the Lithuanian court, and his sentence was reduced from life to 15 years. However, his joy was short-lived. A few weeks later, the court overturned the decision, and Narigis was once again sentenced to life in prison, with no chance of returning to a comfortable cell in Sweden. 5 years later, In August 2022, Neregis was transferred to a prison in Lithuania. While other prisoners were being moved to another ward, one of them attacked and seriously injured Neregis, leading to his death on the way to the hospital. As for the suspect's wife, her involvement in the case has not been completely ruled out. The police stressed that it was almost impossible for her to be directly involved in the kidnapping or murder. If that were the case, experts would have found her DNA on the victim's clothes or belongings. However, it cannot be ruled out that she knew about Neregis's crime and tried to help him escape punishment by providing a false alibi. Neregis's brother also raised questions. Cafe employees reported seeing two men standing near the barn and watching them. Assuming that one of them was Neregis himself, the other man could have been his brother. However, the man's DNA was not found in the barn or on Lisa's clothes, making it unlikely that he was involved in the murder. Hey detectives! Welcome back. We've got another mysterious case to explore. The case of Angie Hausman. Angie Hausman was born on February 18, 1984, in St. Louis, Missouri. Her father left the family before she was born, and she would never have the chance to meet him. However, her mother married a man named Ronald when she was 1 year old, and in the addition of a younger brother to the family. The two sisters got along very well, with Angie particularly fond of her younger brother. Angie was known for her friendly and outgoing personality, always striving to build relationships with those around her. Her family resided in a peaceful suburban neighborhood in St. Louis. In 1993, at the age of 9, Angie attended the 4th grade at a local elementary school, about a mile away from her home. Her daily go-to-school involved taking a bus from a nearby stop, which her parents considered relatively safe due to its proximity to their house. Typically, Angie and her neighborhood friends walked together from the school to the bus stop after class. There were many parents watching from their windows to ensure their safety. This has become a habit in their neighborhood, intended to provide peace of mind that children will return home safely. On November 18th, Angie followed her usual routine, attending school and finishing at 3 p.m. She took the school bus home with a few neighborhood kids. At that point, the other kids continued to their homes. Angie walked alone the short remaining distance home, because her house was farther away. However, Angie didn't arrive home, and as the minutes passed, her parents started to worry. They knew Angie often chatted with friends on her way home, but it has never taken this long. Concerned, Angie's mom and stepdad decided to walk along her route from the house to the bus stop to see if they could find her. While walking, they met other kids from Angie's school. They confirmed she had gotten off the bus with them and headed in the direction of her home. The parents also spoke with neighbors who usually kept an eye on the kids, but were preoccupied on that particular day and hadn't seen anything. Angie's parents became more and more worried and insecure. They and their friends started searching the area along her route from the bus stop to their home. As the sun began to set and darkness fell, they didn't give up. Realizing Angie was unlikely to wander off in the cold weather, the parents eventually decided to call the police. The police immediately joined the search for Angie. Due to the cold weather, it seemed unlikely that she would wander off alone. Therefore, the police initially focused on investigating whether she had been kidnapped. 10 days before Angie went missing, an 11-year-old girl was almost kidnapped in a nearby area, which made everyone even more concerned. An unknown person approached the girl as she got off the school bus and attempted to pull her into the bushes. Fortunately, she managed to escape. However, since the assailant was still at large, the police believed he might be linked to Angie's disappearance. To investigate, officers deployed K9 units, which detected Angie's scent near the bus stop. The dogs tracked the scent about halfway to her house, but lost it suddenly, suggesting that Angie might have gotten into a vehicle at that location, which further supported the possibility of an abduction. The police expanded their search for Angie by deploying helicopters with thermal sensors and scouring the banks of a nearby stream, but they failed to locate either the girl or her belongings. The first day, the search turned up no results. As the investigation unfolded, the police released information about Angie's disappearance to the media, which quickly spread throughout the city. The police department receiving over 300 calls within 24 hours. To manage the influx of leads, more than 20 additional officers were assigned to the case. However, none of these clues were helpful in finding Angie. The detectives pursued every lead, with a strong focus on Angie's stepfather from the beginning. Despite this, he insisted he was innocent and willingly cooperated with the investigation, even agreeing to take a lie detector test in an effort to clear his name and help the police focus on finding Angie. During the investigation into Angie's biological father, a new piece of information came to light. Although he had never been in direct contact with his daughter, but the biological father had allegedly driven past her house multiple times to watch her play outside, according to Angie's mother. While detectives found this behavior suspicious, the biological father had a solid alibi that checked out. By the third day, the FBI joined the investigation, and the police department allocated even more officers to the case. It was clear to everyone that something serious had happened to Angie, as she could barely survive on the streets in such harsh weather conditions. A break in the case came when a witness in Angie's neighborhood reported seeing a suspicious man driving a blue sedan. The description matched a person who had attempted to abduct a girl just 10 days earlier. Based on this, investigators created a composite sketch, which was featured in the media and appearing on thousands of distributed flyers. Unfortunately, the identity of the suspect remained a mystery. As Angie's disappearance gained national attention through television, the number of leads increased. Police carefully evaluated each one but found no connections to the case. However, as the case drew more public attention, psychics started contacting Angie's family, claiming to have had visions of the missing girl. One psychic even named a specific location, a large national park 25 miles from Angie's home, where they believed she was being held. However, detectives chose not to pursue this information. To encourage tips, a $10,000 reward was offered for any information about Angie's location, resulting in an influx of tips. During the investigation, detectives discovered a disturbing detail. A few days before she disappeared, Angie mentioned to her teacher that she would be going on a nature trip with her uncle. However, this statement raised red flags, as Angie did not actually have an uncle, and her parents were unaware of what she meant by this claim. Detectives considered the possibility that Angie might have known the person who took her, referring to them as her uncle in conversation. Despite their efforts, investigators failed to uncover any information about this mysterious individual in the days that followed. The case seemed to be at a standstill until 9 days after Angie's disappearance, on November 27th. A young girl's body was discovered near a tree, severely mistreated. She had no clothing on and was bound with handcuffs. Her head was completely covered in tape, except for a small exposed area around her nose. A nearby bag contained personal items, including notebooks with her name, that confirmed the body was that of Angie. Autopsies by medical examiners revealed more disturbing details about Angie's death. A piece of underwear was found stuffed in her mouth after the tape on her head was removed. The investigation determined that she had died just hours before her discovery and had likely been held captive for 9 days before succumbing. Furthermore, experts concluded that Angie suffered numerous physical injuries and endured a sexual assault. A thorough examination of the crime scene by forensic experts led to the discovery of a fingerprint on the tape used to cover Angie's head. The police tried to find matching information in the database and between several suspects, but didn't bring any clues. Following the discovery of the body, the police increased their efforts in the investigation. As news of the tragic incident spread, local residents became fearful, increasing their vigilance. To protect their children, they started escorting them to and from school, meeting them at bus stops, and keeping a close watch over them at all times. On December 1st, a 10-year-old girl named Casey Dissa went missing in a nearby town, just 10 miles from Angie's house. Casey had received permission from her mother to visit friends who lived a short distance away, but she never made it to their home. The police were unsuccessful in locating her, fueling the detectives' fear that they might be dealing with a serial killer. Initially, detectives did not rule out the possibility that the same person was responsible for both Angie's and Casey's disappearances. However, they lacked evidence to support this theory. 10 days later, Casey's body was found in St. Louis, wrapped in bedding in a curtain. The cause of death was determined to be severe head trauma from multiple blows. Despite the investigation, detectives were unable to uncover any leads pointing to the killer. Furthermore, the distinct nature of the two crimes led them to reconsider their initial theory. As a result, they began to consider the possibility of two separate murderers in the same month. Investigations into Angie's disappearance led detectives to identify a man who had attempted to abduct another girl a few days earlier. The suspect, 37-year-old Gary, frequently traveled to St. Louis for work. Although he became a person of interest in the murders of Angie and Casey, he had a solid alibi for the time they went missing. However, during questioning, Gary admitted to assaulting 4 other girls and was ultimately sentenced to 5 years in prison. The following February, the case took a new turn. Near where Casey's body was found, investigators found tire tracks that were associated with a pickup truck from a well-known rental car company known for its distinctive logo. Detectives showed photos of the tire tracks to locals, asking if they had seen a pickup truck from that company in the area. The detectives received a crucial lead. One woman came forward, saying she had seen such a pickup near her neighbor's house about a week after Casey's disappearance. After investigation, the police discovered that the house belonged to a woman living with her husband and brother. She claimed none of them had rented the pickup and maintained they were not connected to the case. However, detectives remained skeptical and obtained a search warrant for the house. The search revealed blood matching Casey's in the basement, along with the murder weapon. A further investigation uncovered key information in Casey's case. The pickup truck used to transport the body was rented by Thomas, the brother of the woman who owned the house. Initially, Thomas denied any involvement in the crime. However, when presented with the existing evidence, he eventually confessed. According to Thomas's statement, Casey knocked on his door and wanted to invite his nephews to come out with her. Thomas invited Casey into the house and led her to the basement, where he attempted to assault her. When Casey screamed, Thomas hit her with a heavy object, ultimately killing her. He then covered her body with bed sheets. Despite committing the crime, Thomas went to work as usual. Upon returning home, Thomas' sister told him that she had discovered the body in the basement, but she didn't want to know what had happened and asked that it be disposed of quickly. Casey's body remained in the basement for a week because outside, the search was still going on for her. Thomas was too afraid to move Casey's body until the investigation died down. Once the situation became less intense, Thomas rented a pickup truck, transported Casey's body to St. Louis, and abandoned it there. Thomas was eventually convicted of Casey's murder and received a death sentence. However, he died in prison several years later due to illnesses before the sentence could be carried out. During the investigation, Thomas denied any connection to Angie's case, leading detectives to believe that the two cases were not connected. The investigation into Angie's murder stagnated for many months, with the number of leads dwindling over time. Years later, detectives encountered a new obstacle: the expiration of the reward for providing information, which detectives feared would decrease public involvement. However, a local businessman donated $250,000 to incentivize people to come forward with information. This bonus was one of the biggest at the time, generated a large number of tips, but disappointingly, the case remains unsolved. In 2001, a prison inmate named Corey Fox contacted detectives and confessed to over 10 murders, including the murder of Angie Houseman. Detectives met with Corey, then he recounted how he and an accomplice abducted Angie from the street and held her captive in his house for several days. Initially, the plan was to demand a ransom in exchange for Angie's safe return. However, Corey and his accomplice became concerned that they might be identified and decided to murder her. Corey provided detectives with many accurate details about the crime, including the fact that Angie was tied to a tree and that his accomplice used her underwear as a gag. However, some discrepancies arose during the questioning, particularly with regards to how Angie was restrained. Corey claimed that they used plastic handcuffs, but evidence showed that perpetrator actually used iron handcuffs. Furthermore, investigators discovered that Corey could not have committed some of the murders he confessed to. As a result, police concluded that he likely fabricated parts of his confession, possibly drawing information from media of Angie's case. In the summer of 2002, when a 6-year-old girl was abducted from her home and murdered in a different St. Louis neighborhood, authorities initially considered whether the two crimes were connected, but this theory proved unfounded. The killer, a neighbor, was quickly caught and confessed during questioning. The investigation into Angie's case lay dormant for several years, until 2007, when detectives reopened the file. Upon reviewing the case documents, they stumbled upon a noteworthy detail. Shortly after Angie's body was discovered, police had found a man named Roger Martin sitting in a parked car nearby. When questioned about his emergence, Roger claimed he was in the area to go hunting. However, a search of his vehicle revealed no hunting equipment, raising suspicions about his true intentions. The new detective team decided to investigate Roger further, which revealed his prior convictions for crimes against children. Notably, one of his past victims was assaulted near the area where Angie's body was discovered. All of these crimes happened before Angie's death, but the police had failed to thoroughly look into Roger at the time. This meant that the new team had to start over from the beginning. The detectives brought Roger in for questioning, but he denied any involvement in Angie's murder. He claimed that he just happened to be near that location. The interrogation lasted 9 hours, but still yielded no new clues. The police compared Roger's fingerprints with the ones on the tape found on Angie's head, but the experts found that they did not match. As a result, Roger was released. Although the police continued to consider him a suspect, they lacked sufficient evidence to hold him. The case of Angie saw a breakthrough in 2018, when the St. Louis Police Department created a task force specifically to investigate this case. With the advancement of technology, the detectives re-examined the existing evidence, searching for new leads. Their investigation centered on 3 crucial pieces of evidence: the handcuffs, the tape from Angie's head, and her underwear used as a gag. Despite repeated efforts since 1993, experts had struggled to detect the perpetrator's DNA on these items. The task force decided to re-examine the evidence with modern technology. The detectives first focused on the handcuffs but encountered a difficulty due to the presence of Angie's blood covering almost the entire surface. Next, they turned their attention to the tape from Angie's head, but faced another obstacle. Upon opening the box containing the evidence, they discovered that the tape had deteriorated significantly over time. Finally, they examined the underwear that had been used to gag Angie. Although they did not have much hope for this evidence, since it had been in her mouth for hours, so it was likely that any foreign DNA had been removed. However, they still investigated it as a last resort. Using advanced technology, they carefully examined every inch of the underwear, leading to a breakthrough: a small sample of DNA was found, sufficient for analysis. The experts confirmed the DNA belonged to a male and immediately uploaded it to the FBI database. Although it is common for DNA searches to yield no matches, requiring additional investigation, the detectives were fortunate in this case. As soon as the DNA sample was uploaded, they received a full match. The DNA belonged to 58-year-old Earl Cox, who had been incarcerated since 2003. In the investigation into Angie's case, Earl Cox initially had not been on the police's radar, but his criminal record was substantial. His history of crime dated back to 1982, when he was serving in the military in Germany and working as a part-time babysitter. 4 girls reported being sexually assaulted by Earl, resulting in an 8-year prison sentence in the United States. He was subsequently discharged from the Army after serving only 3 years. Earl was released from prison early and moved to St. Louis. However, 4 years later, he found himself in trouble with the law again. In this instance, he was arrested after 2 7-year-old girls accused him of sexually assaulting them. Although the charges were eventually dropped due to a lack of evidence, the arrest itself was a parole violation. As a result, Earl received an additional year in prison. After serving this extra year, Earl was released in 1992 and settled in St. Louis, where his relatives lived. The following year, a tragic incident happened. Earl abducted and killed Angie. In 2002, Earl was arrested again for operating a secret online platform where individuals shared child abuse content. The FBI had been monitoring his activities and set a trap by having an undercover agent pose as a 14-year-old girl and make contact with him. Earl made explicit intentions to exploit the girl and sent money for her to meet him. However, when Earl showed up at the meeting place, he was met by armed FBI agents instead of the girl. This led to his arrest. A search of his computer revealed a massive collection of over 45,000 images of child abuse. Further investigation also revealed that Earl was the mastermind behind the platform, leading to the arrest of 60 more individuals associated with the site. This operation was one of the largest against pedophiles in the country. In 2003, Earl was sentenced to 10 years in prison. However, when his sentence ended, a judge used a legal loophole to keep Earl in detention, citing him as a serious threat to children. As a result, Earl remained in prison. In 2019, a DNA match linked Earl to Angie Hausman's case. Detectives visited him in prison, but Earl denied involvement and requested a lawyer. Despite the strong DNA evidence, investigators took an alternative approach. They offered Earl's lawyer a deal. In exchange for Earl's confession, the prosecution would drop the death penalty and pursue a life sentence instead. Earl agreed, likely aware that he would lose the case in court. When detectives returned to the prison, Earl shared his account of incident. Although some details raised suspicions, his admission to the murder was the key point for investigators. Earl claimed that on November 18, 1993, he was driving through his family's neighborhood when his car broke down. And while he was trying to find out what was wrong with the car, a school bus pulled up and children disembarked. While the others went home, Angie remained outside, drawing Earl's attention. Earl claimed that when Angie approached him, they had a brief chat, and he noticed she seemed extremely cold. He offered her a ride in his car, which she allegedly accepted. Earl then took Angie to Burger King to get food, and afterwards, took her to his home. Here, he sexually assaulted her for several days. Eventually, Earl decided to dispose of Angie, drove her to a remote location, where her body was later found, and tied her to a tree. However, she was still alive at that time. Detectives had doubts about certain parts of Earl's story. They didn't think Angie would agree to go anywhere with a stranger, especially since she only had a short distance to walk home. Investigators have questioned Earl's story about the car breakdown, as he claimed the car stalled but started again as soon as Angie approached. It seems more likely that Earl saw Angie and decided to abduct her. A more probable scenario is that he lured her into the car by lying or threatening her. This is more credible than his confession. Detectives were to obtain the confession they needed for the murder. Earl Cox was sentenced to life in prison without parole by a judge in August 2020. Although justice had been served, it came too late for Angie's mother, who had passed away from cancer in 2016. Her husband, Ronald, felt that Cox's actions had indirectly contributed to her death. As her grief over losing Angie had weakened her health and will to live, ultimately leading to her passing. For Earl, his sentence was more than just the initial verdict. Authorities re-examined a previous case of sexual abuse involving two 7-year-old girls, for which Earl had initially received a lenient sentence. At that time, he had only spent 1 year in prison for violating his parole. However, years later, investigators contacted one of his victims, now an adult, and asked for her testimony against him. Faced with the of a life sentence, Earl chose to plead guilty and as a result, received an additional 10-year prison sentence. Hello, crime enthusiasts, are you ready for another chilling investigation? The case of Candy Rogers. Candace Rogers, also known as Candy, was born on July 18, 1948, was either. After her birth, her parents divorced, but her father remained in the same city, allowing Candy to spend time with him regularly. As a child, she enjoyed the outdoors, often going for walks and playing with her dog. She also dreamed of joining the Campfire Girls, a girls-only organization similar to the Boy Scouts. In 1959, Candy joined the Campfire Girls at the age of 9. One of the organization's activities was selling mints door-to-door. On Friday, March 6th, she planned to sell mints after school. After returning home, having dinner, and playing with her dog. Then she took about 8 boxes of mints and headed out. Candy had planned to walk around her neighborhood and sell sweets to the people living nearby. To ensure that the other girls selling sweets in the area didn't overlap, each girl was assigned specific streets to visit. However, when Candy failed to return home by her expected time of 6 p.m., her mom started to worry. Candy's mom and grandfather set out to search for her, but they couldn't find her anywhere in the neighborhood. As darkness fell, the search party grew, with family, friends and neighbors joining in to help. Despite their combined efforts, they were unable to find any sign of Candy. Convinced that something was wrong, Candy's mom decided to call the police. As the police joined the search, they began by questioning the neighbors. Their investigation revealed that she had only made one sale, suggesting that something may have happened to her soon after she left home. A witness reported seeing Candy on a nearby street around 6:30 p.m., which seemed unusual since her mother was already searching for her by then. Candy's grandfather reported some unusual incidents after going to search for his granddaughter. On the same street where a witness last saw Candy, he nearly got hit by a speeding green 1956 Ford. Although the police distributed the car's description, they were unable to locate it due to the lack of a license plate number. Later, at around 9 p.m., several mint boxes belonging to Candy were found along the road near a bridge, increasing the concern for her safety. The police intensified their search in this area, combing the riverbanks and a nearby wooded zone throughout the night. Unfortunately, Candy was not found. As news of Candy's disappearance spread, local newspapers covered the story, and it eventually gained statewide media attention. In 1959, child disappearances near their homes were extremely rare, making Candy's case even more disturbing. The residents of her town had not experienced a similar incident in many years, leaving them deeply shaken and concerned. The next morning, police increased their search by deploying more personnel and resources, including mounted police, off-road vehicles, and military members. A large number of volunteers from the city and surrounding areas joined the search, swelling the total number of search to over 1,000 people. This made it one of the largest searches in the country's history at the time. The search area was expanded to 11 miles around Candy's home, but despite this, no signs of her were found. Tragically, on the same day, a search helicopter clipped power lines and crashed, claiming the lives of 3 of its 5 crew members. Undeterred, the search efforts continued for many days, but yielded no results. Police officers worked tirelessly in multiple day and night to try and locate Candy. Investigators also followed up on approximately 750 tips received in the early days of the search, but unfortunately, every lead ended in a dead end. 15 days after Candy went missing, 2 military personnel on a hunting trip in the woods west of Spokane stumbled upon children's shoes on the ground. Recognizing the shoes as possibly belonging to Candy, they immediately reported their discovery to the police. The shoes were confirmed by Candy's grandfather. He said they were indeed hers. After discovering this clue, police conducted a search of the woods and they quickly found Candy's body, partially hidden in the underbrush and covered with pine branches. A medical examination revealed that the cause of death was strangulation, using a torn piece of fabric from Candy's own skirt. Injuries on Candy's hands and feet suggested that she had been tied up, although no ropes were found near. The police investigation showed that Candy had been sexually abused. During their search of the crime scene, the police discovered a green car seat cover nearby, although they were unable to establish if it was linked to the murder. A small, purple stain was also found on Candy's clothing, which gave off a strong scent of grape-flavored chewing gum. Despite all efforts, the police still could not find relevance between this stain and the case. With limited clues, police searched for any clues that might help them find the killer. They thoroughly investigated numerous tips and looked into the potential involvement of hundreds of people. This group included neighbors, people of interest, and previously convicted individuals. However, the investigation eventually narrowed down to focus on one particular suspect, Alfred Braves, a 50-year-old man. The reason Alfred became a suspect because, on the same day Candy's body was found, he died in his car, near where Candy's boxes of mints were found. Additionally, Alfred lived near Candy's home. Upon finding his body, police discovered a rope and a strand of hair that was not Alfred's, which belonged to a woman. Investigators obtained a search warrant for Alfred's home. Upon searching his house, they discovered numerous newspaper articles detailing sex crimes against women and girls. The police also found that several women had accused him of harassment, and even his own wife had suspicions about his involvement in Candy's murder. However, despite the suspicious circumstances, the police were unable to find any concrete evidence that directly linked Alfred to the crime, and investigators were hesitant to clear him of suspicion. In the face of a lack of evidence, detectives shifted their focus to other suspects. Over several months, the police diligently investigated each person, but every lead turned out to be a dead end. Later, investigators found another suspect, a serial killer named Hugh Morse. He was arrested in 1961 for a string of crimes. The important evidence that Hugh was involved in Candy's case was that he had a habit of chewing grape-flavored gum, which was similar to a substance found on Candy's clothes. Furthermore, additionally, he had committed 2 murders in Spokane a few months after Candy's death, further increasing the suspicion of his involvement in the crime. Hugh began committing crimes quite early. His first arrest was for assaulting a woman, but the penalty was lenient. He was merely discharged from the army. He then went on to commit multiple robberies in Los Angeles and served only a 6-month sentence. After being released, Hugh tricked 2 8-year-old girls into going with him to a secluded area by promising them ice cream. He then sexually assaulted them. This crime led to his arrest. However, Instead of going to prison, a medical commission determined that he was a sexual psychopath. As a result, he was placed in a mental health facility for a period of 2 years to receive treatment. After his release, doctors thought Hugh had fully recovered. He then moved to Spokane, where he began peeping into women's windows. His actions took a more severe turn in November 1959, when he broke into the home of a 28-year-old woman and acted violently, ultimately killing her. 10 months later, Hugh entered the residence of a 69-year-old woman, repeating the same crimes as before. A month after that, he assaulted another woman, stabbing her multiple times. Although she sustained severe injuries, she managed to survive the attack. After escaping the city, he continued a devastating crime spree over several months, brutally attacking and sexually assaulting numerous women and girls with a knife, ultimately claiming the lives of 2 more victims. To evade capture, Hugh constantly moved from city to city and state to state, until the FBI intervened. He was eventually added to the list of the country's 10 most wanted fugitives, which ultimately led to his capture. Hugh received multiple life sentences, but his troubles didn't end there. He attempted to end his life in his cell. Fortunately, the guards intervened in time and saved him, allowing him to continue serving his sentence. Detectives in Candy's case visited Hugh in prison multiple times, trying to gather information about the case. Despite repeatedly denying any involvement, he took a polygraph test to prove his innocence. The test results suggested he was telling the truth, but these results are considered unreliable and therefore cannot be used as evidence in court. At the time of the murder, Hugh lived in Spokane, and furthermore, he had a criminal record of similar incidents that made investigators suspicious. They initially considered him the primary suspect due to he familiar with this neighborhood. But he consistently denied any involvement. Although they suspected him, they did not have enough evidence to conclude his involvement in the crime. The police then shifted their attention to another suspect, 49-year-old Howard Barnett. He was arrested in February 1960 for allegedly molesting a minor girl. Shortly after his arrest, he ended his life right in his cell at the Spokane police station. Hugh wrote a cryptic message in his own blood on the wall before his death, stating, "He have a sin before the Lord." However, it wasn't until after he passed away that his wife became aware of his arrest. She then asked the police if they thought Hugh might have been involved in Candy's death. Despite several investigations, no concrete evidence was found to connect Hugh to the crime. The police continued to pursue new leads over the years, looking into other possible suspects. A woman came forward with information, stating that on the day of Candy's disappearance, she saw a green car following her. Police reopened the case multiple times but were unable to gather evidence linking the green car or any other. The case was reopened periodically over the years but always hit a dead end. The investigation into Candy's murder was complicated by numerous false confessions. 13 individuals came forward claiming to be the killer, but when questioned by the police, they couldn't provide any details that only the real killer would know. Instead, they simply repeated details they had read in the newspapers. The police department changed personnel a lot during the investigation. However, none were able to solve the case, allowing Candy's murder to remain one of the state's most notorious and baffling crimes. The crime had a profound impact on the local community, leading many parents to reevaluate their perception of safety and ultimately changing the way they supervised their children's outdoor activities. In the early 2000s, the case was reopened, and a new detective used modern technologies to help with the investigation. Fortunately, the police had collected and preserved crucial evidence in 1959, which allowed experts to take another look. By using modern DNA analysis, they were able to identify a male semen sample on the Candy's clothing. Further analysis of the DNA sample was done to create a profile, which was then entered into the FBI database, but yielded no matches. Investigators also compared the DNA to samples from multiple suspects, but none of them matched. For many years, people suspected Hugh Morse of committing the crime, but forensic evidence revealed no link between him and the murder. As a result, the investigation stalled once again. Although the police had a DNA sample from the perpetrator who sexually assaulted and killed Candy, identifying the individual continued to elude them. In 2021, authorities reopened the case, and a new detective chose to use genetic genealogy, a cutting-edge DNA analysis method, had already solved numerous cold cases. By applying this innovative approach, the detective hoped that the case will be solved. The detective reached out to several labs that specialized in the analysis he needed, but they all shared the same frustrating news. They concluded the sample had deteriorated too much, making it impossible to extract the necessary information. Undeterred, the detective contacted one final lab, and it has provided new clues that are helpful to the investigation. Armed with state-of-the-art tools, the experts were able to analyze the sample successfully and generate a DNA profile of the perpetrator. This profile was then uploaded to genealogical databases, allowing investigators to begin searching for the DNA owner's relatives. After carefully examining thousands of individuals, then they narrowed down their focus to one specific family. Upon investigating this family, the investigators discovered that the DNA sample likely came from one of three brothers, but all three brothers had passed away. However, one of the brothers had a living daughter. The police reached out to her about the possibility that her father might have been involved in the murder. Despite her initial shock, she agreed to cooperate with the investigation. The woman provided a DNA sample, which was compared to the semen found on Candy's clothing. The results confirmed that she was closely related to culprit, who left the DNA evidence on Candy's clothing. Based on this new information, the police obtained a court order to exhume the woman's father's grave. DNA experts extracted a DNA profile from his remains and compared it to the semen found on Candy's clothing. After a 62-year wait, the results revealed a definitive match between the DNA from the woman's father and the semen found on Candy's clothing. This confirmed that the perpetrator was a man named John Ryhoff. John Ryhoff was not initially identified as a suspect following Candy's murder. However, detectives later investigated his biography and found links to other crimes. At the time of the murder, John was 20 years old and lived within a mile of Candy's house. He was also stationed at an army base near where her body was discovered. 2 years after the murder, John committed another crime when he attacked a woman, binding and sexually assaulting her, then attempting to kill her. The woman managed to survive the attack. As a result of the assault, John was arrested and sentenced to 6 months in prison. He also received a dishonorable discharge from the army. Upon his release from prison, John started a family and has 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. He kept a low profile and appeared to be living an ordinary life, working multiple jobs. One of these jobs was at a food packaging plant, where he suffered a severe chemical burn to his face and leaving a scar. John finally ended his life in June 1970, at the age of 31, leaving no note or explanation. The authorities determined that the victim, Candy, may have known her killer, John. Candy's friend, who was 10 years old at the time of the murder, was revealed to be the killer's sister. Years later, she recalled how she cried in her brother's, John's arms after learning about Candy's death. Unaware that he was the person responsible. Sadly, Candy's parents did not live to see their daughter's case solved. Candy's mother passed away in 2006, and her father died life in 1963, for years after Candy's murder, likely due to his inability to cope with his loss. After 62 years, the case was finally solved, marking one of the longest investigations in history. The investigation involved multiple detectives from different generations. At the press conference announcing the killer's identity, only one officer who worked on the case in 1959 was present. He expressed gratitude for having lived long enough to see the case resolved and to finally know the truth. The daughter of the killer, John Ryhoff, initially struggled to accept that her father committed such a heinous crime. However, she eventually came to terms with the fact, describing her father as a monster who took an innocent girl's life. She has expressed regret that her father was not held accountable for his actions during his lifetime. Welcome back, mystery lovers. Today's case is going to keep you on the edge of your seat. The case of Gretchen Harrington. Gretchen Harrington was born on June 13, 1967, in Pennsylvania. She was the youngest of 3 daughters, but her family didn't stay in Pennsylvania for long. Soon after her birth, they moved to the small town of Bumo, where her father, a pastor, obtained a job at the local church. Gretchen immediately loved this new town. She spends a lot of time outdoors with her sisters and her new friends. The town was incredibly safe, giving parents felt comfortable letting their children play outside until nightfall. The town of Bumo seemed to be the ideal place for kids from a religious family to grow up. As a result, Gretchen spent a lot of time at her father's church and excelled in Sunday school, consistently earning top grades. On August 15, 1975, Gretchen's mother and newborn sister were set to return home from the hospital. 8-year-old Gretchen was excited to meet her new sibling. However, her father reminded her not to miss Sunday school, considering her perfect attendance record and high grades. Although Gretchen was hesitant, but she decided to attend church, taking her Bible along. Normally, she would have walked to church with her older sisters, but on that morning, they stayed home. The church was only a short distance away, less than a mile, so she didn't feel afraid to walk alone. The Sunday school lessons were divided into 2 sessions. First, the children gathered at Trinity Church, and after about an hour and a half, some of them, including Gretchen, were to head to her father's church. However, when the kids arrived at the second church at 11:30 a.m., Gretchen's father noticed that his daughter was missing. Thinking that Gretchen might have stayed at the first church, her father called Trinity Church to check. David's wife, a Sunday school teacher and pastor's spouse, answered the call. She reported that Gretchen was not there. She immediately informed her husband, David, about the situation. He was surprised to hear this, as Gretchen had not been in attendance at his Sunday school class that morning. Growing increasingly worried, Gretchen's father asked David to contact the police while he began searching for his daughter. He drove along the route between the 2 churches, checked nearby streets, and reached out to the parents of Gretchen's friends, but she was nowhere to be found. Her friends were all either at church or at home, and Gretchen's best friend, who was David's daughter, hadn't seen her all day. The police quickly launched a search for Gretchen. As people learned about her disappearance, they rallied together to help find her. Since Gretchen's father is a well-respected local pastor, hundreds of volunteers joined the search, many of whom knew and admired him. The volunteers and police scoured the town and surrounding areas, including wooded regions and the riverbank. A police helicopter even assisted the search from above. Despite the extensive search continuing late into the night, but they still couldn't find Gretchen. The search for Gretchen continued to grow the following day, with even more volunteers joining To aid in the search, the police created and distributed flyers displaying Gretchen's photo and details about her disappearance to motorists and along roads. Despite these extensive efforts, the police were unable to uncover any leads or determine what had happened to Gretchen. As the days went by with no new information, Gretchen's disappearance remained a mystery, deeply impacting the town. In the past, it was common for children to have the freedom to roam the streets without adult supervision. They would often spend hours exploring the woods and swimming in the nearby river with no one watching over them, and their parents rarely worried. However, the recent disappearance of Gretchen changed everything, which sparked widespread fear and anxiety among residents. As people tried to make sense of what had happened, various theories emerged. Some speculated that Gretchen might have left home voluntarily, while others believed she may have drowned while swimming in the river. The most disturbing theory, however, was that she had been kidnapped. As a result, parents became extremely cautious, no longer letting their children out without supervision. One mother even went as far as cutting her daughter's hair short to disguise her as a boy. Overnight, the once peaceful town turned into a place of uncertainty and fear. Police have also questioned anyone who may be involved in Gretchen's disappearance. They gathered several new leads from conversations with witnesses. One witness reported seeing a girl who resembled Gretchen near the church that morning, approached by a green station wagon. However, the witness did not see what happened next. Another person shared a similar story, but described a white Cadillac approaching the girl. The police investigated these leads by identifying and checking the owners of matching vehicles in the area. Unfortunately, this did not yield any results. 4 days later, a resident of Westchester, a nearby town, contacted the police after finding children's shorts that matched the description of Gretchen's clothing. Investigators showed the shorts to Gretchen's mother, but she confirmed they did not belong to her daughter. From then on, there was still no progress in the case. The search operation was eventually suspended, and the focus shifted to the investigation. The police continued to interview witnesses and follow up on any available leads. However, as time passed, the chances of finding Gretchen alive grew increasingly slim. On October 14th, a jogger in a national park, approximately 20 minutes from Bumo, made noticed something strange in the bushes. Initially, he wasn't sure what it was, but upon closer inspection, he realized it was a human body. The jogger immediately reported the things to the park rangers, who then alerted the police. Upon investigation, the authorities determined that the remains belonged to a child. However, identifying the child to be extremely difficult due to the advanced state of decomposition. Investigators initially suspected it might be Gretchen, so they showed her parents pictures of the clothes found next to the remains. These clothes had been carefully folded. Gretchen's mother confirmed the clothes found belonged to her daughter, as she had made them herself. Forensic experts further the identification by matching the remains to Gretchen's dental records. The cause of death was determined to be multiple severe blows to the head, and the case was reclassified as a homicide. The body was so decomposed that investigators were unable to determine any further details about the circumstances surrounding her death, including whether she had been sexually assaulted. Additionally, DNA analysis technology was not available at the time, 1975, leaving investigators without any DNA clues to pursue. The town was shaken by the news of Gretchen's murder, leading to an influx of tips for the police. As concerns about a violent offender still on the loose grew, citizens urged authorities to swiftly bring the perpetrator to justice. As the investigation continued, authorities received numerous tips about suspicious individuals seen in the park where Gretchen's body was found. Unfortunately, these leads did not aid in the case. Investigators also thoroughly vetted nearby residents with a history of violent crimes, but this approach yielded no results. Several months after the body was discovered, the case came to a standstill with no new developments. In subsequent years, detectives would periodically reopen the case, thoroughly reviewing existing leads and tips, but to no avail. This was largely due to a lack of evidence. Even with advancements in DNA analysis, the police found no concrete leads. No foreign DNA was found on Gretchen's body or her clothes, leaving the case unsolved for decades. The investigation was periodically mentioned in the media, but public interest waned. Following the crime, parents in the town became highly cautious and protective of their children due to fearing another attack. This collective fear lingered for years. changing the lives of Brawl's children. Months later, that a crucial piece of information came to light. A woman contacted the authorities to share her account and met with the lead detective to tell her story. At the time of Gretchen's murder, the woman was 10 years old and lived in Havertone, close to Gretchen's home. She was friends with Gretchen and her older sisters, as well as other kids in the neighborhood. The woman often slept over at her friends' houses. One incident, in particular, stood out and was pivotal to her coming forward. While sleeping over at a friend's house, the woman woke up in the middle of the night to find the friend's father touching her. She then saw him quickly leave the room and was too afraid to tell anyone. However, the same thing happened again the following night. The next morning, she confided in one of her friends, who surprisingly revealed that this was a common occurrence. The friend's father would often come into their room at night. The woman immediately reported this to her parents when she returned home. But instead of contacting the police, they simply forbade her from visiting the friend's house again. This disturbing incident occurred just 1 week before Gretchen's disappearance. The woman shared a crucial piece of information with the authorities: the name of the man she suspected, David Zandstra, a pastor who taught at the Sunday school. However, her account didn't end there. She also shared a disturbing incident involving one of her friends, which happened a month after Gretchen's disappearance. This friend was approached by a man who tried to kidnap, but her friend managed to avoid the situation by refusing to get into his car. The man who made the attempt was none other than David Zandstra. To support her claim, the woman provided detectives with her personal diary from that period. In the diary entry dated September 15, 1975, she recorded a conversation with her friend, who had begged her to keep a secret due to concerns that David might cause her harm. With this new information, the police reopened the case. Upon re-examining the original case materials, detectives uncovered several suspicious details that indirectly pointed to David's involvement. Notably, it was he who initially reported Gretchen's disappearance to the authorities. The pastor David gave investigators a precise description of Gretchen's clothing: dark blue zip-up shorts with front studs and pockets. He also mentioned a white top and braided hair. However, David claimed that he had not seen Gretchen that day. This raised a question: how did he know what she wore, especially since his description's claim was later confirmed to be true after Candy's body was found, as she was wearing the exact same clothes he described. Further investigation revealed that the Sunday school classes were delayed by 50 minutes due to the pastor David's late arrival. This delay would have given him enough time to abduct Gretchen, kill her, dispose of her body in the park, and return to the church to begin teaching. According to David's initial statement, he drove some children in his van to Candy's father's church after the classes, and only became aware of Candy's absence when her father said it out to him. A significant detail in the case was that David, his wife, and their 3 children relocated to another state just months after Gretchen's disappearance. Notably, David owned multiple vehicles, including a green station wagon that drew police attention. A witness had previously reported seeing a similar vehicle near the church on the day Gretchen vanished. Given these clues, detectives decided to interrogate David. At 83 years old and residing in Georgia, David agreed to speak with detectives at the local police station on July 17, 2023. When David realized the detectives suspected him of murder, he initially responded with denial, asking what evidence they had against him. However, the detectives revealed 2 key pieces of evidence: a woman's testimony about an incident at his house, and allegations of him molesting his own daughters. David's demeanor drastically changed. As he realized his dark past was exposed, he stopped denying the accusations and, after 48 years of silence, he began to speak about the murder. According to David's account, on a Sunday morning, he drove his green American motor station wagon to Gretchen's father's church. There, he saw Gretchen walking outside and offered to give her a ride. Gretchen accepted, likely because their families were friends, and she was also on her way to his Sunday school classes. However, instead of taking Gretchen to the church, David drove her to a secluded park area. He ordered her to undress, but she refused and she asked to be taken home. David then hit Gretchen repeatedly on the head, knocking her unconscious. After Gretchen lost consciousness, David removed her clothes and assaulted her. He then drove her to another park and checked for a pulse, but found none. Believing she was dead, he carried her body into the bushes and covered it with branches. David then returned to the church to teach his Sunday school class. After he confessed, the police arrested him to Gretchen's murder and had him extradited to Pennsylvania to face trial. His arrest sparked a wider and more thorough investigation. Detectives suspected that David had assaulted multiple girls, and they strongly believed there were additional victims. The fact that he had been a pastor in various cities and states for decades led as it suggested he may have committed many more crimes. Because David was a pastor, respected by everyone, he initially was not suspected. However, with the truth finally exposed, detectives collected his DNA sample and began comparing it to evidence in unsolved cases. They also investigated unsolved disappearances of girls in cities where he had been employed. Investigators quickly identified a case similar to that of Gretchen. In 1991, 4-year-old Amanda Campbell from California, she vanished from her home in a quiet neighborhood without leaving any clues. Notably, at the time of Amanda's disappearance, David was a pastor in that same neighborhood. Although there is currently no evidence linking him to the crime, police have identified similarities between the two cases, suggesting he could be a suspect. David Zanstra, now 83, is being held in a jail in Cobb County, Georgia. He was denied bail and denied extradition to Pennsylvania, despite he filing an extradition request.